The course of history is full of stories of those who gave their all. Some of these tales have become part of popular culture, while others have been sadly forgotten. Tonight, History UK Corral brings you 10 of history's most legendary last stands. Central Mexico, October 9, 1847. As the streets of the small town of Huamantla erupt in violence around him, Texas Ranger Samuel Hamilton Walker fires with a revolver in each hand into the hordes of oncoming Mexican soldiers pouring towards him. Walker and his fellow Texas Rangers are attached to General Winfield Scott's U.S. Army under the moniker of the 1st Regiment of Texas Mounted Rifle Volunteers. They are assisting in efforts to finish the Mexican-American War against the legendary General Santa Anna's already beleaguered forces. While they are all veterans of vicious close-quarters combat, Walker and his Ranger cohorts are not soldiers in the conventional sense. They are countrymen in the U.S. Army and Naval forces who have traveled and fought with them hold the Rangers in a class all their own, a distinction imbued with equal parts fear and respect. In the 2 decades since their inception at the behest of legendary Texas statesman Stephen F. Austin, the Rangers have built a reputation as perhaps the fiercest force on the frontier to combat the incessant murder and raiding that plagued the central Texas countryside at the hands of tribes like the Comanche, as well as horse and cattle thieves. They have also combated Santa Anna's forces before, 10 years earlier, during the fight to annex Texas from Mexico in the Texas Revolution. It is said that a Texas Ranger can, quote, ride like a Mexican, trail like an Indian, shoot like a Tennessean, and fight like the devil. But, in conjunction with the nationwide regard for their bravery and fortitude in warfare waged on the absolute bleeding edges of the frontier, they have also amassed another reputation, one that casts the average Ranger as a ruthless, trigger-happy brute, one averse to all manner of discipline, and completely devoid of any notion of mercy or humanity. Tales abound, even in these relatively early stages of their existence, of the Rangers' unparalleled predilection for abusing and often executing the prisoners that they had taken before ever presenting them at trial. It was said that a Ranger would sooner hang a man than feed him as a prisoner, and oftentimes this adage had proven true, as the nature of the warfare being conducted on the Texas frontier did not, by and large, draw men who were naturally prone to the order and discipline of conventional warfare in the 19th century. They had been designed to be a highly mobile attack force, meant to combat the masterful Comanche, who had for so long decimated conventional military attempts to unseat them as the dominant power in Texas. The nature of this warfare and the nature of the men fighting it had often resulted in scenes of murder, mutilation, and unjust arrest and imprisonment that had driven Santa Anna himself to declare the Rangers as no better than pirates and brigands and refused to grant them any quarter should they be taken prisoner. The general was not only appalled by the Rangers' reputation and their actions against his men in battle, but also their clear lack of cohesion and traditional discipline. Even their physical dress and appearance itself often drew his ire and disgust. The Rangers did not wear uniforms, with each man donning the clothing he thought most practical, comfortable, and, of course, stylish. Jim Gillette, a Ranger who served in the 1870s, gave a description of the typical Ranger dress that recalls that there is, often, no uniformity in the manner of dress, for each Ranger is free to dress as he pleases, and, in the garb experience has taught him most convenient for utility and comfort. A Ranger, as any other frontiersman or cowboy, usually wears good heavy woolen clothes of any color that strikes his fancy. Some are partial to corduroy suits, while others prefer buckskin. A felt hat of any make and color completes his uniform. While riding, a Ranger always wore spurs and very high-heeled boots to prevent his foot from slipping through the stirrup, for both the Ranger and the cowboy ride with the stirrup in the middle of the foot. This is safer and less fatiguing on a long ride. For arms, the Ranger often carried a Winchester rifle or carbine, a Colt .45 revolver, and a Bowie knife. 2 cartridge belts one for Winchester and one for revolver ammunition, completed his equipment, and so armed, he was ready to mount and ride. But, for all their apparent lack in traditional discipline, the Rangers have proven to be unparalleled in their effectiveness on the battlefield. In a world where the conventionalities of modern warfare had been cast aside in favor of sheer, unfettered brutality, they have managed not only to survive, but to thrive. They are also fiercely loyal to their leaders, men who have risen through their ranks through years of hard trekking, riding, and fighting. And, among this group of large, unshaven, unruly, and often violent men, it is no small wonder that the quiet, clean-shaven, and smartly dressed 30-year-old Samuel H. Walker has earned the highest level of respect and regard through his bravery and leadership under fire. In the eyes of many of the younger Rangers, Walker is a living legend. Born in present-day Greenbelt, Maryland, Walker had enlisted with the Washington City Volunteers in 1836 and served in the Creek Campaign in Alabama. He had come to Texas in 1842, arriving at the port of Galveston. Here, he had served under Captain Jesse Billingsley in combating the forces of Mexican General Adrian Wall. As part of the infamous Mier expedition, Walker had been part of a legendary event, one that would cement the animus between the Rangers and their Mexican counterparts for decades to come, when he and 242 other Texans had been captured by Mexican forces at the Battle of Ciudad Mier on December 26, 1842. They had been marched to Mexico City, and on February 11, 1843, 181 of the Texans had managed to briefly escape, but 176 of them, including Walker, had been recaptured. The now enraged General Santa Anna had ordered every one of the 176 Texans to be executed by firing squad. However, diplomatic efforts by foreign ministers from Great Britain and the United States, still a separate country from Texas at the time, had prevailed in convincing the general to execute only 1 out of every 10 of the prisoners. Thus, General Santa Anna revived the macabre practice of the decimation punishment employed by the Roman army. To determine the prisoners to be executed, the Mexican officers had placed 159 white beans and 17 black beans in a jar. The Texans were made to each draw a bean from the jar, with those who drew a white bean being left to live, and those who drew a black bean being designated among the unfortunates to be brought in front of the firing squad. Walker had, in fact, been among the fortunates to draw a white bean, but had been permanently enraged by both the executions of his friends and the treatment of himself and his fellow Texans afterwards, as they were impressed into work gangs and made to build roads around Mexico City. Walker and his companions, including other future Texas Ranger legends like Bigfoot Wallace, would not be released until September of 1844. Many of them, Walker and Wallace included, would return to Texas, only to enlist with the Rangers in hopes of exacting their retribution upon General Santa Anna and the Mexican army. Samuel Walker had enlisted at the end of 1844, and initially served with distinction under the legendary Captain Jack Hayes, himself a rare exception to the hard-bitten Ranger stereotype, before rising to the rank of captain himself. Walker had distinguished himself not only through his actions on the battlefield, but for his innovations in what would go on to become one of the most legendary sidearms in the history of the Old West. In 1846, Walker had traveled to New York City on a self-funded trip to meet with the weapons manufacturer Samuel Colt. Colt was a Connecticut-born inventor whose 5-shot Colt Patterson revolver was being used by the Rangers to revolutionize tactics and techniques in fighting the highly mobile Comanche. Before the advent of the Colt Patterson revolver, so named for its inventor and its birthplace in Paterson, New Jersey, the Rangers had been relegated to single-shot rifles and pistols. The Comanche, able to unleash several arrows a minute from atop their notoriously quick and agile horses, had oftentimes been able to overwhelm and decimate Texan forces who found themselves essentially defenseless after firing their initial volleys. With the Colt Patterson revolver, Jack Hayes, Samuel Walker, Bigfoot Wallace, and the McCulloch brothers, Ben and Henry, had revolutionized the fight being waged against the Comanche by employing far more aggressive tactics enabled by the volume of fire they were now able to produce with their 5-shot revolvers. Though not the first revolver in history, the Colt Patterson would prove to be one of the most influential. Weighing in at a hefty 2 pounds 12 ounces, the single-action revolver measured a total length of 13 3/4 inches with a barrel length of 7.5 inches, firing a 28 or 36 caliber ball with an effective firing range of roughly 59 meters. Though only boasting a 5-shot chamber, the increase in firepower from its predecessors in the Texans' single-shot pistols was exponential. But, though they had been used thus far to great success, the Colt Patterson revolver still presented a number of issues that rangers in the field found cumbersome to deal with. Though it indeed enabled a greater rate of fire, it had to be loaded by detaching the cylinder, then placing 5 bullets inside and reattaching the cylinder before closing the weapon and carrying on the fight. However, Samuel Colt, living on the East Coast, had no way of knowing of the ranger's specific needs in weaponry. That is, until he began to receive letters from Samuel H. Walker, suggesting improvements that might be made to the weapon. Eventually, a friendship between the two men had developed, resulting in Walker's 1846 trip to New York. After meeting with local officials and even President James K. Polk, who had personally requested to speak with the renowned Ranger captain, Walker had spent several days poring over the details of Colt's revolver design and suggesting improvements he believed could make an immediate difference for himself and his cohorts in the field. What resulted was perhaps the most well-known, influential, and impactful sidearm in American history, the Colt Walker revolver, or, as most would come to know it, the Walker Colt. Boasting a new 6-shot cylinder, the Walker Colt weighed in at 2 pounds heavier than its predecessor at a hefty 4.5 pounds. It measured 15.5 inches in length with a gun barrel length of 9 inches and fired a 44 caliber ball with an effective firing range of 100 yards. In comparison to the sidearms carried before it, the Walker Colt all but amounted to a small hand cannon with its size, weight, and firepower. To commemorate his friend's contribution to the design and the Rangers' contribution as a whole, Colt had included an engraving of the 1844 Battle of Walker's Creek, in which the Rangers had used their revolvers to turn the tide against the Comanche in a bloody fight in the Texas Hill Country just north of San Antonio. Walker would return to Texas and then on to the Mexican-American War, where he and the Rangers would fight first on the Rio Grande with future President General Zachary Taylor before heading south to join forces with General Winfield Scott in Veracruz. The first shipment of his signature revolvers would be shipped to him only 4 days before the fight that now rages in the streets of the city of Huamantla, providing the 30-year-old captain with a much-needed lift in morale, as he and his Rangers fighting in conjunction with conventional American forces had, thus far, proved a trying affair for both parties. General Winfield Scott, a former lawyer who had served as an officer in the United States Army since the War of 1812, had been appointed as the commanding general of U.S. forces on this campaign south into Mexico. Though he had a complicated and conflict-ridden relationship with President James K. Polk, Polk had deemed it necessary to advance American forces past the Rio Grande in order to break General Santa Anna's forces and usurp the Mexican government. General Scott, ever a prescient career military man, had preemptively drawn up invasion plans that he presented to the president and was granted command of the invasion as he had devised the blueprint for it himself. Serving under the general on this mission would be a litany list of American officers who would, 14 years later, go on to play pivotal roles in the American Civil War. They included Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, George B. McClellan, George Meade, P.G.T. Beauregard, Joseph E. Johnston, and Jefferson Davis. Scott's plan of attack was to sail his forces to the Mexican port at the city of Veracruz, land his forces, and make the roughly 250-mile march west to the capital of Mexico City. A longtime career officer, General Scott insisted on employing strict military discipline on his campaign, a familiar order of affairs for his experienced officers, but one that was largely unfamiliar and palpably uncomfortable for his newly acquired ranger forces. The Rangers' reputation as outlaws and guerrilla fighters had already caused them considerable consternation, as reports from General Zachary Taylor on the Rio Grande had remarked that, quote, "The mounted men from Texas have scarcely made one expedition without unwarrantedly killing a Mexican. The constant recurrence of such atrocities is my motive for asking that no more troops be sent to this column from the state of Texas." But, while Taylor's reports are largely based on hearsay, it is this very reputation as ruthless, unconventional frontier fighters that makes them suited to land with General Scott's conventional forces and scout the hundreds of miles of perilous hills and roadsides, all swarming with guerrilla fighters and army lookouts, from Veracruz to Mexico City. Taylor's admonitions had, in fact, ultimately necessitated Jack Hayes's direct intercession with President James K. Polk, in which a deal was struck that allowed 2 regiments of Rangers to incorporate into the existing U.S. Army Command, officially to be known as the 1st Regiment of Texas Mounted Rifle Volunteers, with Hayes serving as colonel and Samuel Walker as lieutenant colonel. Walker and his men would be tasked with providing security for the critical supply line as Scott and his forces advanced upon Mexico City, but it would be here that Walker would clash with one Colonel Francis Murray Wynkoop. Wynkoop, a devotee of General Scott's strict conventional military style, would repeatedly find himself at odds with the headstrong Rangers, foremost among them Samuel Walker. In the first of such incidents, Wynkoop had ordered Walker's advance guard of 50 Rangers to retreat back to Wynkoop and his men's position in case of an ambush amidst the hilly country. Walker had simply refused the order, instead opting to remain out ahead of Wynkoop's forces. Later in the day, the 2 contingents of Americans had indeed been ambushed by 500 Mexican troops under the command of General Santa Anna. Walker and the Rangers had kept this force, nearly 10 times their size, at bay, until Wynkoop and his men were able to reinforce them. Another nearby American unit had also come to their aid and driven off the Mexican soldiers after a 2-mile running gunfight. While Walker and his Rangers had perhaps played the significant role in combating and thwarting the Mexican attack, Wynkoop, nonetheless, had remained incensed at Walker's repeated insubordination. Walker, for his part, accused his commanding officer of cowardice. A second incident occurred on the road to Mexico City when Wynkoop had ordered Walker to preemptively attack 2 small villages along the route. Walker argued that the villages were full of non-combatants and posed no threat that warranted an attack. He also, in no uncertain terms, made clear that he, and even his battle-hardened Rangers, took deep issue with the regular Army's practice of looting the civilian populations along their route to Mexico City. Wynkoop, indignant at a charge made by the leader of a group that he considered as little better than criminal vigilantes, had confronted Walker, and the 2 men had nearly come to blows. After being separated by the other men present, Walker and his Rangers were ordered to proceed to the nearby Chapultepec castle, which was being used as the Americans' field headquarters. Here, Walker was stripped of command and confined to his quarters for his refusal to follow orders. And here, Walker remained, growing more indignant and incensed by the hour, not only at his confinement, but, most of all, at his separation from his command. Meanwhile, during this time of personal animosity and professional vitriol between Walker and Wynkoop, General Scott's forces had reached and eventually taken over Mexico City. More reinforcements had also landed at Veracruz, under the command of General Joseph Lane, and had already begun their march eastwards towards the capital city. However, when General Lane had stopped at the castle to rest and refit his outfit of men on their way from Veracruz to Ciudad Puebla, where a now weakened Santa Anna had fled from Mexico City to take part in a siege of American forces inside the city of Puebla, he had been appalled to learn of Walker's confinement and ordered him to be released and returned to command of his men immediately. General Lane ordered that Walker and the rest of the Rangers would now attach themselves to his contingent, acting in the same capacity as they had for General Scott, as scouts and advanced security forces. The Rangers and Army soldiers had been nearly ready to move out, When General Lane received word from one of his many scouts that General Santa Anna was in fact not at the city of Puebla, but instead at the nearby town of Huamantla. With this newly gained intelligence, General Lane had ordered that his men and the Rangers would instead proceed to Huamantla immediately. The Rangers, roughly 200 in number, would ride ahead as the advance force, and they would attempt to take over the city and, if possible, to find and capture or kill the infamous General Santa Anna. They had arranged themselves in lines of 4 and advanced into the city at a full gallop, each man with his saber drawn, searching the city streets and alleyways for any Mexican soldiers. Their charge had been met in force by the mounted forces of Mexican lancers, whose elongated weaponry had wrought havoc upon American forces throughout the whole of the Mexican-American War. The two forces had clashed in the midst of the city, with close-quarters urban warfare unfolding in brutal, bloody fashion, with sabers slashing, lances stabbing, and men falling and dying in the middle of the dusty streets. Samuel Walker, for his part, was now firmly ensconced within his preferred environment. With violence and chaos raging all around him, with buildings catching fire and snipers firing from rooftops and windows, Walker had slashed his way to the center of town, even decapitating an unfortunate Mexican soldier who attempted to charge him. Now, with his pistols drawn, Walker sits astride his trusted warhorse, shouting exhortations and encouragement to his men, who now try to carry out the battle in a systematic fashion, going house by house down the city streets, clearing each building of any of its residents before moving on to the next. As the fight intensifies, General Lane and his men now make their advance towards the city, moving at a rapid clip towards the urban battlescape as shrieks of the wounded, the retort of Ranger revolvers, and the smoke from the flaming buildings fill the air. It seems now that the momentum has swung solidly in the favor of the Americans, as their reinforcements near the city, and building by building continues to be cleared by the experienced, efficient Rangers. Then, just as the Rangers believe the deciding moments of the battle to have been won, a sickening sight befalls their eyes. As Samuel Walker methodically aims and fires his revolvers into a crowd of oncoming lancers, a shot from a Mexican rifle rings out from one of the second-story windows above him. Walker's body suddenly falls limp and slumps out of his saddle, hitting the ground with a sickening thud, audible even amidst the ongoing din of battle. As blood pools in the dirt around him, creating a sickening crimson paste that cakes onto the blood and clothing of his rescuers, Walker is dragged behind a small adobe wall. It is clear to all that he is mortally injured. Still, Walker encourages his Ranger cohorts to fight on, reminding them that General Lane's troops are likely only minutes away. A first-hand account of his final moments from one of the Rangers who served under him during the battle recounts that, quote, "He sunk down immediately and was borne into the yard, the men bursting into tears as the cry spread among them, 'Captain Walker is killed.' Captain Walker directed that we should, quote, 'never surrender,' and died in about 30 minutes. The Rangers do, indeed, continue to fight, many of the young men now nearly overwhelmed with a simultaneous torrent of grief and rage. General Lane's troops soon pour into the city, overtaking the Mexican forces, though narrowly missing General Santa Anna, who manages, again, to abscond into the countryside under the security of his most loyal devotees. The victory for the Americans has been won, and victory for the Americans in the war is now nearly assured. But Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Hamilton Walker now lies cold in death, and the Texas Rangers will never be the same. After the battle, despite the notable, highly consequential victory they have just attained, many among the Rangers find themselves too overwrought with grief at the loss of such an admired comrade to indulge in much revelry. Instead, they would steel their already feared resolve, going on to take their vengeance against the local populations on their way to Mexico City before riding into the capital under the command of Colonel Jack Hayes. When Hayes was accosted by a citizen throwing a rock, a Ranger comrade shot the offending Mexican man dead where he stood. The Rangers would go on to fortify their reputation amongst the people of Mexico as Los Diablos Tejanos, or the Texan Devils, as in the coming months they would rule over Mexico City with an iron fist, and the ongoing enmity between themselves and the citizens of Mexico would carry on for decades. After the Mexican-American War came to an end on February 2nd of 1848 with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, General Santa Anna would find himself exiled to Kingston, Jamaica for 2 years, before attempting yet another bid to retake control of his beloved homeland. While his comrades continued to exact their revenge on the people they viewed as responsible for his death, Samuel Walker was buried in a small but reverent ceremony in Mexico. The ceremony was presided over by his former professional adversary, Colonel Wynkoop, who was deeply aggrieved at having not mended his relationship with the legendary Ranger before his passing. Walker would later be reinterred in San Antonio at the Oddfellows Cemetery, before again being moved to what is today known as the Alamo Masonic Cemetery in San Antonio. A year before his own death, before traveling to the East Coast, Walker had attended the funeral services of his close friend and fellow Ranger, Robert Addison Gillespie, who had been killed in action at the Battle of Monterey. Walker had requested that, should he fall in battle, he be buried next to his comrade in arms. This request was granted, and today the two Rangers lie interred next to one another at the cemetery located near the famed Alamo Dome in San Antonio. In the years after the war, the Texas Rangers will find themselves called on again, as the Comanche raiding in Texas will only intensify in the coming years. Many of the young Rangers who have seen action in the Mexican-American War will go on to rise to prominent positions, such as John Rip Ford, Ben and Henry McCulloch, and Bigfoot Wallace. Many of the commanding officers from the U.S. Army forces will also go on to positions of high command in the coming decades, with several becoming generals and 2 becoming presidents. But the countless stories of the conflicts, controversies, and tragedies that surround the Mexican-American War, as well as the stories of the individual soldiers, sailors, and civilians who fought on both sides of the conflict, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Southwestern Nebraska, August 5th, 1873. A group of Pawnee hunters crouch low in the prairie grass so as not to betray their silhouettes against the pre-dawn skyline. They are led by a respected tribal leader, Sky Chief. Amongst the hunters is Sky Chief's young son, a young boy who is no more than 6 or 7 years old. Though too young to participate in this hunt, he is excited and proud to be along with this group of grown men whom he idolizes and so often emulates. Their quarry on this summer morning is a herd of buffalo, several hundred strong, from which the Pawnee hope to harvest a sizable bounty of hides, horns, and hooves, as well as stores of invaluable meat, organs, and fat that will see them through another harsh plains winter. The Pawnee had once been a formidable force on the central plains of the North American continent. In the early 1700s, they had numbered 60,000 people and controlled vast swaths of what is today the American Midwest. But after almost 2 centuries of disease and warfare, their numbers have dwindled to a few thousand. By 1873, they have acquiesced to the U.S. government's attempt to confine them to reservation lands in Nebraska. This buffalo hunt, a long-standing tradition amongst the tribe, had only been granted to them in the previous few years as a final opportunity to practice their ways and to fortify their winter food supply at little to no cost to the federal government. The year prior, in 1872, they had been accompanied by a contingent of agency scouts led by Texas Jack Umahundro, a legendary scout, cowboy, eventual actor, and longtime friend of Buffalo Bill Cody. As the agency scouts stood watch and provided protection to the camp, the Pawnee men were able to venture out to hunt without fear of retributive attacks from their longtime enemy, the Lakota. Under the watchful eye of well-armed sentries, the Pawnee had managed to procure enough buffalo meat to get them through the upcoming winter. However, the Lakota had raided their reservation incessantly during the winter of 1872 to 1873, and the Pawnee suffered greatly as a result. In the springtime, the Pawnee chiefs conferred and decided that another hunt was indeed wholly necessary for the survival of their tribe. They petitioned the federal agents of the reservation for another contingent of scouts. They requested that these scouts be led by Texas Jack, as he had comported himself so reputably during the summer prior, and thus solidified a lifelong respect and companionship between himself and the Pawnee. But in the interim time between the summer of 1872 and the spring of 1873, several major changes had occurred in the administration of the Pawnee Reservation, known as the Genoa Agency. First, a new superintendent had been installed. His name was William Burgess, and like his predecessor since 1869, he was a Quaker. President Ulysses S. Grant had installed Quakers as Indian agents in the hopes that contact with pacifist, peaceable whites would quell the raging frontier violence that had plagued the continent for centuries and stalled American expansion for decades. Grant, in fact, believed that the root cause of much of the violence on the bleeding frontier was due to the treatment of the native tribes by the overly aggressive, needlessly bellicose, and haplessly short-sighted settlers. He hoped this plan would stem the tide of violence that, at times, seemed like it might overrun a third of the country, but he would be gravely disappointed. From the very start, William Burgess had not inspired confidence in his leadership abilities. Luther North, a revered member of the Scouts that had served the reservation, described Burgess as woefully unqualified, noting that, quote, "His judgment where the Pawnee are concerned, if anything, is poorer than any of the other agents the Pawnees have had." Burgess had attempted to address the terrible situations at the reservation by passing out annual rations earlier than promised, but this proved an inadequate solution to the poverty and starvation that plagued the tribe. Feeling as though he had little other feasible course of action, Burgess authorized the tribe to travel to the Republican River in hopes of repeating the previous year's hunting success and placating the Pawnee for one last year until they could be brought fully to bear as idealized American citizens. The plans for the excursion began in late spring, with the initial intent being to repeat the steps taken in the previous year's hunt. Texas Jack was asked to lead the agency's scouting party, and a wave of much-needed hopefulness spread through the desperate, hungry camp as spring turned to summer. However, due to an administrative oversight on behalf of the reservation agents, the Pawnee were ultimately unable to secure Texas Jack's services. Though he had repeatedly applied to lead the Pawnee party, no word had come in return. With no confirmatory word from the Genoa Agency, Texas Jack had signed on to appear in Buffalo Bill Cody's stage show in New York, and was thus drawn away by his new obligation. The Pawnee, now bereft of an agency representative they considered trustworthy in the field, beseeched Burgess to grant the position to a 22-year-old Wisconsin-born homesteader named John W. Williamson. Williamson had signed on that spring as an agriculturalist for Fort Genoa, and had solidified a mutually congenial relationship with the Pawnee. He had no experience in guiding on the trail, no experience in the territory, and spoke only passable Pawnee, and, being all too keenly aware of these facts himself, had never applied for nor expressed any interest in leading the Pawnee hunting expedition. The Pawnee hoped that this might work in their favor, as Williamson's lack of territorial and tactical wherewithal would likely mean drastically less strict practices than those employed by Texas Jack. This hunt could very well be their last hurrah on the Great Plains, and the Pawnee did not want it interfered with by what they viewed as an overly restrictive white man, no matter how reputable, well-liked, and well-intentioned Texas Jack may have been. Burgess, believing he had no better immediate options, acquiesced to the Pawnee's request for Williamson to be installed as the nominal leadership. The Pawnee had ventured out from Fort Genoa in a party of roughly 400, mostly women and children. They had made their way, in high spirits, to the hunting grounds on the Republican River, believing themselves adequately protected and free of some of the previous year's more burdensome restrictions. Initially, the hunt had been a rousing success. In the month of hunting leading up to this day, the Pawnee had managed to harvest roughly 800 buffalo. Each animal killed means a measure of security for their families, and all present have, thus far, been pleased with their progress. On this day, though, something is different. The air seems unusually thick, and the buffalo more skittish than usual. The evening prior, a group of white buffalo hunters had stopped by the Pawnee encampment. They had warned Williamson and Sky Chief that they had seen a large encampment of the Pawnee's mortal enemy, the Lakota, 25 miles upriver. They had warned that the Lakota party was clearly on the warpath and undoubtedly on the hunt for the Pawnee. Word had spread quickly amongst the Lakota that the Pawnee were back this summer on the Republican River, lands that the Lakota hold to be rightfully theirs. The white hunters had warned that the Lakota were out for blood. Sky Chief had scoffed at this notion and decried the hunters as simply more lying white men, trying to keep him and his people from their rightful hunting grounds. But now, as he hunkers down watching the buffalo herd and mindfully keeping his young son close to him, Sky Chief begins to wonder if those hunters had in fact been telling the truth. Then he hears the hoofbeats. Suddenly, a party of 50 Lakota warriors on horseback and in full war regalia crests the ridge behind the Pawnee. Almost instantaneously, the two parties, Lakota and Pawnee, are in sight of each other. Some accounts have Sky Chief and his warriors as being in the middle of skinning some of the buffalo they have already killed. However, in either account, the Pawnee have been caught wholly unprepared to defend themselves. It is clear to Sky Chief at a moment's glance that this small party of Lakota are the initial scouts sent out to find and make first contact with the Pawnee. He knows that the contingent now attacking himself and his warriors is likely but a fraction of the entire Lakota force. As the Lakota let loose their piercing war cries and barrel down the ridge towards them, the Pawnee hunting party knows there will be no surviving this morning. Within moments, Sky Chief, his young son, and the remainder of his forces are cut down. The Lakota will later report taking no prisoners from this attack, leaving all Pawnee present lying still in death. Having located their enemy, the Lakota reconnaissance party of roughly 50 warriors makes their way back to the main contingent of Lakota, roughly 1,000 strong, hidden behind a bluff a few miles away. After being alerted by the reconnaissance party, this larger war party, under the leadership of War Chiefs Littletail and the aptly named Pawnee Killer, immediately ride out towards the remainder of the Pawnee. The remaining Pawnee, with only 100 warriors left and the rest being women and children, are making their way down a canyon near the Republican River when the Lakota smash into them in a whirlwind of violence and bloodshed. The battle that further ensues is unbelievably fierce, with every man present knowing that the fate of his family would be the same as that of Sky Chief, his men, and his young son. Though they fight valiantly, the majority of the Pawnee warriors are simply and quickly overwhelmed and cut down. Williamson and two older Pawnee men managed to make an escape back to the west in hopes of linking up with the nearest U.S. Army element in the area and procuring assistance. However, they will not make it back in time. The surviving Pawnee women and children have retreated into the canyon and are now trapped within its recesses. One by one, young and old are ruthlessly hunted down and taken prisoner, or immediately dispatched at the end of Lakota arrows and lances. Though many are cut down, many are taken prisoner, all of them knowing that their fates now will likely be worse than their deceased comrades. Any valuables that can be carried are tied down to Lakota horses. Then, almost as suddenly as they had struck, the entire party of Lakota, with their newly taken trophies and prisoners in tow, are off, over the hills, and seemingly free from worry of pursuit or retribution. Only hours later, in the afternoon of August 5th, U.S. cavalry soldiers who had been alerted by Williamson and his cohorts arrive on the scene. Riding with them is Army Dr. David Franklin Powell. Surveying the horrific scene, he counts 59 Pawnee bodies. Visitors from nearby towns, who have been alerted to the events and come to see the aftermath themselves, count there to be significantly more. Correspondent Royal Buck of the Nebraska City News wrote that it was a massacre and nothing more, and nearly 100 victims are lying on the ground, and 2/3 are squaws and papooses, small Indian children. On August 8th, news of the massacre reaches the Pawnee back at the Genoa Agency. For days afterwards, the fort is a cacophonous scene as the weeping and lamentations of the Pawnee women fill the air. Meanwhile, a few Pawnee who have managed to escape the canyon make their way 80 miles to what's known as Plum Creek, an offshoot of the Platte River. Here, they are tended to by Dr. William M. Bancroft, and then put on a train back to Fort Genoa. For weeks afterwards, Lakota warriors are spotted in various camps about the prairies, proudly displaying their war trophies. In a visceral display of the generations-long enmity between the two tribes, it is apparent to outside observers that what had been a horrific massacre to the Pawnee was a just and necessary victory in the eyes of the Lakota, one that, by its very nature, warranted great pride and celebration. Lakota accounts of the battle report as many as 300 Pawnee being killed, with no Lakota casualties being taken. The events of Massacre Canyon in 1873 are, to be sure, unique, but not in their level of ferocity, nor in the scope of their violence, nor in the intensity of the disdain between the two tribes, nor the grief inflicted and suffered by both. Instead, Massacre Canyon will be unique in the history of the Old West because it will mark the last great battle between Plains tribes on the North American continent. However, in the scope of history, the stories of warfare, raiding, violence, and atrocities between tribes are too numerous to cover in one episode. For tonight, those are other stories for other times. Mexico City, September 13, 1847. As Chapultepec Castle casts a formidable shadow in the early morning light, the fields below its towering stone walls erupt in an onslaught of attacking United States Army infantrymen, as well as a small contingent of United States Marines. Inside the stone walls and lining the parapets of the medieval-looking structure are 750 Mexican soldiers composed of local natives, itinerant farmers, and adolescent cadets from the nation's military school headquartered here at the castle. They are Mexico's last line of defense in the ongoing Mexican-American War, the final barrier to the American forces taking of Mexico City. As the men inside the castle attempt to aim and fire upon their attackers, many are rebuffed by the incessant thunderous striking of U.S. artillery fire into the castle walls. The American barrage has not stopped since it began the day prior, and every shot seems to further disrupt the nervous systems of the defenders atop the walls. As a thick miasma of gun smoke envelops them, the shrieks and groans of the wounded mix with the shouts of orders from the commanding officers, creating a horrifying cacophony of gore and chaos. In the fields beneath the castles, the American forces have been tasked with what many among them consider to be an impossible mission of weathering the Mexican defenders' fire and scaling the steep castle walls. However, under the staunch direction of their officers, they storm forward, knowing that every second spent in the open could be their last, as bullets and artillery rain down upon them. For their part, the Marines have already carved out a formidable reputation as an invaluable American military asset. It had been November 10, 1775, when, in the Tun Tavern in Philadelphia, the Continental Congress had authorized the creation of 2 battalions of Marines. The concept of Marines, soldiers trained to fight at sea and on land, was derived from the British tradition. Many of America's first Marines had served in His Majesty's Royal Marines, learning the unique challenges of fighting aboard wooden ships and conducting amphibious operations. These early iterations of Marines were essentially maritime raiders, whose task was to serve aboard American ships, board enemy vessels, and conduct small unit landing operations. In March 1776, the Continental Marines conducted their first amphibious landing, raiding British naval installations in the Bahamas. Samuel Nicholas, the Corps' first commandant, seized gunpowder and weapons desperately needed by Washington's army. Throughout the Revolutionary War, Marines served aboard American warships, fighting as sharpshooters from the rigging and leading boarding parties. During the long and ruthless war, they developed a reputation for accuracy with their muskets and fierce hand-to-hand combat skills. After independence, the Marines were briefly disbanded, but threats to American shipping from Barbary pirates led to its re-establishment in 1798 under President John Adams. This new Marine Corps would face its first major test in the Mediterranean. Their involvement in what would come to be known as the Barbary Wars solidified the Marine Corps culture. In the Corps' first major land operation, Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon led an expedition across 600 miles of desert to attack the Libyan city of Tripoli in 1805. During the War of 1812, Marines again proved their worth in ship-to-ship combat. Aboard the USS Constitution and other American frigates, they served as sharpshooters, picking off enemy officers and helmsmen at crucial moments. Between wars, the Marines developed a unique dual role. They provided security at America's naval yards and also served as a ceremonial unit in Washington. The Marine Band, known as the President's Own, became a symbol of national dignity at official functions. By 1846, on the eve of the Mexican-American War, the Marine Corps was a small but highly professional force. They numbered only about 1,000 men, but their combination of naval and land warfare skills made them uniquely valuable for the coming campaign. When war broke out with Mexico, Marines were among the first units deployed. Now, their unique skill set will be tested to its utmost in the fight for Chapultepec Castle. Along with their rifles and sidearms, the Marines carry climbing ropes and shoulder long climbing ladders with which to scale the walls of the castle. The castle itself, its very shape and structure harkening back to the days of the 11th century Crusades, is a national landmark of great pride for the Mexican people. The beleaguered Mexican forces fighting on behalf of General Santa Anna's army have endured weeks of critical defeats at the hands of the encroaching U.S. military forces, and have resorted to melting down the giant bells that had once adorned the castle parapets for use in making bullets and cannonballs. The veterans among them are mostly members of the Battalion de San Blas, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Felipe Xicotencatl. In the preceding days, these men have spent the majority of their time in hard labor, attempting to fortify the walls of the castle with sandbags and add to its defenses by digging ditches around its perimeter. Now, after nearly 24 hours of artillery bombardment, much of their efforts have been withered away under the effects of cannon fire. With every diminution of their defenses, many among the Mexican forces feel their morale begin to waver, as the looming possibility of being overrun by the Americans seems to be a more and more likely scenario. Still, the youngest among them remain undaunted. To the great admiration of their elders and superiors, the roughly 50 cadets from the National Military Academy now fight with unbridled tenacity, unleashing volley after volley into the attacking American forces. Despite their age and rudimentary training, their resolve carries the air of a Spartan-esque determination to fight until the very end in defense of their homeland. On September 11th, 2 days prior to this battle, Colonel Nicholas Bravo had ordered that all of the military academy's cadets evacuate the castle, as he had assumed the oncoming American attack would indeed be a brutal affair. In preparation for the assault, the American forces have been split into two factions of 250 men each. The first group is commanded by U.S. Army Captain Silas Casey and General John Quitman. Just after 8 a.m., they reach the road that leads to the entrance of the castle. As rifle fire, cannonballs, and grape shot pepper the ground around them and decimate their ranks, the Marines finally reach the base of the castle walls. Here, as fire continues to fall down upon them from the defenders directly above, they rush into position with their scaling ladders. Moments later, as their Marine comrades provide covering fire at a near vertical trajectory, the first of the intrepid amphibious assaulters crests the top of the parapets and begin to lay down fire of their own as a vicious close-quarters fight unfolds atop the castle walls. In the midst of the vicious melee, Captain Silas Casey is grievously wounded, leaving Marine Corps Major Levi Twiggs in his place as commander. At the same time, a second party of American troops, under the command of Army Captain Samuel McKenzie and General Gideon Pello, advances up the eastern side of the hill atop which the castle lies. For roughly an hour, the battle unfolds as the American forces manage to breach the massive entrance gates and storm the entirety of the castle. Though they have fought ferociously against the divisions of Generals Worth, Quitman, and Pello at the base of the hill, the San Blas Battalion is nearly completely wiped out, with the survivors retreating further into the castle's interior. Atop the walls of the castle, the surviving Mexican troops from the San Blas Battalion, as well as the remaining young cadets, then fight on as they make a concerted strategic retreat to the castle's northeastern corner. The 5 remaining cadets, Agustin Melgar, Juan Escuchilla, Vicente Suarez, Francisco Marquez, and Fernando Montes de Oca, all between the ages of 13 and 20, fight on under the command of the young lieutenant from the National Military Academy, Lieutenant Juan de la Barrera. Finally, as all hope of victory is clearly lost, Cadet Juan Escuchilla, in a final act of defiance, wraps himself in the Mexican flag and leaps from the high stone walls to his death, rather than be captured by the American forces. By 9 a.m., the battle for Chapultepec Castle is over, as General Bravo officially surrenders to the U.S. Army's New York Regiment, and the U.S. Marines hoist the first American flag over the walls of the castle. Though the battle is over, the repercussions of the Battle of Chapultepec have only just begun. They will both be harsh and immediate. At the American field headquarters, a group of 30 Irish immigrants will be among the first to suffer the ramifications of Mexico's defeat. They are known as the San Patricios, or the St. Patrick's Battalion, recent immigrants who had defected from the U.S. Army after suffering the rampant anti-Catholic treatment of their Protestant officers. They had instead chosen to cross the Rio Grande and join forces with their Papist brothers in General Santa Anna's army. Here, they had fought valiantly in several engagements, gaining the enduring admiration of their Mexican comrades in arms. However, they had finally been overrun at the Battle of Churubusco on August 20th, just weeks earlier. Now, under the orders of William S. Harney, they are to be executed by hanging. As a particularly pointed caveat to these orders, Harney has insisted that the men be lined up and made to wait for their demise until the moment the American flag is raised over the walls of Chapultepec in victory. As the flag of the victorious American forces is raised, the lives of the unfortunate San Patricios are snuffed out en masse at the end of 30 rawhide ropes. This action, combined with the execution of 16 more men on September 10th at San Angel and 4 more on September 11th at the village of Mixcoac, is the largest mass execution in the history of the United States. While more than 9,000 American troops deserted during the war, only the San Patricios would face such harsh punishment at the hands of the U.S. Army officers. Back at the castle, General Scott arrives to the cheers of the American forces, and arrangements are quickly made for the Americans to now continue their attack towards Mexico City. By early afternoon, the Army's 15th Infantry has been left to stand guard over the castle, as General Quitman leads the remaining soldiers and Marines as they make their way towards the 2 critical remaining points of ingress into the capital city. The Belen Gate is defended by the Morelia Battalion, commanded by General Andreas Terres. They are composed of 3 cannons and 180 men. However, with their ammunition supplies already dwindling and now rapidly diminishing, Terres and his men quickly draw back to Mexico City, leaving the American soldiers and Marines with now unfettered access to General Santa Anna's last remaining stronghold. Here, with victory in sight, the American forces will face perhaps their greatest challenge yet in the Mexican-American War. Though they have made relatively quick and brutally decisive work out of taking Chapultepec Castle, the fight that will unfold next will be among the most costly in American military history. though they have comported themselves with distinction on this day, giving birth to the Marine Corps hymn's famous line, "From the hulls of Montezuma." The Marines in particular will face horrendous losses in the battle to come. Major Levi Twiggs, hero of this seminal engagement in the Corps' history, will fall just days later on September 15th, alongside 29 other Marines, leaving their casualty rate for the Battle of Mexico City at over 90%, and forever cementing the Marines' reputation as a small but tenacious and uniquely valuable fighting force in the American military arsenal. For General Santa Anna, this is truly the beginning of the end, as the fall of Mexico City, as he well knows, will result in Mexico's ultimate defeat in the war. But the stories of heroism, sacrifice, and suffering on both sides of the Battle of Mexico City, as well as the highly consequential and highly controversial ending to the war, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Central Texas, January 23, 1871. Amidst the rolling landscape that surrounds them, on an isolated strip of cattle trail, 3 working cowboys ride west from the town of Weatherford. They are on their way to the ranch of Britt Johnson, better known as Britt Johnson, who rides at the head of the group. They intend to gather Johnson's cattle and make a return trip to sell them in Weatherford. With Johnson are Dennis Cureton and Paint Crawford. All 3 men are known and respected locally for their skill as cowhands and their dealings in business. They are all also ex-slaves, officially made American citizens and given their freedom less than a decade earlier. However, despite the tenuous state of the nation in the Reconstruction era, Britt Johnson has built a reputation amongst all peoples of the area as a forthright and upstanding citizen, as well as a local hero. 7 years prior, in the summer of 1864, while still under the bonds of slavery, Johnson had been commissioned by his then master to travel to nearby Parker County to procure supplies for the ranch. Britt Johnson had left his wife and young children with the Fitzpatrick family, trusting that they would be safe from the incessant Comanche and Kiowa raiding that plagued the area at the time. Upon his return, Johnson was met with the horrifying news that the small neighborhood he and his family called home had been laid waste to. His son, Jim, and several members of the Fitzpatrick family had been murdered, and the rest of his family had been kidnapped by Comanche and Kiowa raiders. He had secured written permission from his then master to travel alone on the frontier, a legal necessity at the time, and then ventured out on his own in search of not only his family, but the surviving members of the white Fitzpatrick family as well. After months of tracking, and subsequently working his way into the good graces of the tribes, Johnson had been able to negotiate trades for the return of not only his family, but all of the surviving members that had been taken in what came to be known to history as the Elm Creek Raid. Some members of the tribes, though, regarded his dealings as being underhanded and self-interested, as he had reportedly absconded with more rescued captives than the Kiowa and Comanche had agreed to. Thus, some warriors of both tribes vowed that, should the opportunity ever arise, they would take their retribution on Britt Johnson. Now, 7 years later, Johnson pulls his large horse to a halt, as the men set out to make camp for the night. The trusted steed has been with him since before he ventured out alone in search of his family, and is not only a trusted workmate, but a treasured companion. Scampering around the horse's feet, Johnson's small dog greets his owner as he steps from his saddle to the ground, whimpering and excitedly wagging his tail. Though the scene might appear akin to that of a relatively placid modern-day trail ride, the situation at hand is anything but. Though considerable time has passed since the Elm Creek Raid, hostilities between settlers on the Texas frontier and the mighty Comanche and Kiowa tribes still rage, and any territory between towns and homesteads is considered to be dangerous ground for travelers. All 3 men, though, are seasoned hands at both working cattle and fighting hostile native tribes. Thus, they carry about their work of setting up camp for the night with a workmanlike deliberation that, to the outside observer, seems wholly untroubled by the potential danger at hand. However, all 3 men are also heavily armed with repeating rifles and Colt revolvers, a necessity in this territory. They also carry hundreds of rounds of ammunition. As the men finish making camp and prepare to bed down for the evening, they notice another group of working cowhands, hauling freight to Weatherford, camped roughly a mile and a half away. Thinking themselves to be relatively safe for the night, the men soon drift off to sleep after consuming a cold supper. The next morning, January 24th, arrives with the typical merciless chill that plagues the country throughout the winter. As the morning sun begins to peek over the horizon, Britt Johnson, Dennis Curtin, and Paint Crawford rise and begin to prepare themselves and their horses to move on for the day. However, just as their thoughts begin to drift to preparing breakfast and what the day's travel might hold, the three men in the small camp are startled by the sickening sound of thunderous hoofbeats cutting through the morning stillness. Looking in the direction of the sound, the three men see an oncoming cloud of 25 Kiowa warriors, bearing down upon their encampment at full speed. The Kiowa are in the area conducting raiding on local homesteads when they have spotted Britt Johnson and company the day prior. Seeking to make good on their old promise of settling their score with Johnson, they now charge upon the camp in full regalia, their war whoops intermittently piercing through the thunderous cacophony of their horses' hoofbeats. Though a completely separate and much smaller tribe than their allies in the Comanche, the Kiowa are just as renowned in this territory for their bravery, horsemanship, and ruthlessness. While the Comanche are known for their Spartan-like ornamentation, though that has begun to change in the latter 19th century, the Kiowa possess a far more complex cultural tapestry of dress, religion, economics, and social structure. The Kiowa that now charge upon the camp are more ornately dressed than their Comanche counterparts, but their tactics, once familiar to Johnson, Curtin, and Crawford, are drawn from the same well of knowledge and experience drawn upon by the Comanche, as well as other Plains tribes. Rather than a head-on charge at the cowhands' campsite, the warriors maneuver forward in a whirling cyclone, in which the rider nearest the target fires his shot, before continuing on to the back of the circle to reload and return for another shot. The whirlwind of bullets and arrows soon encircles the entirety of the small three-man camp, which provides no cover to its inhabitants. Now, the once placid campsite is engulfed in the storm of violence, as all three men scramble for any semblance of cover they can find. They pour fire from their rifles into the thick oncoming Kiowa formation, loosing dozens of rounds in little more than a few minutes. However, essentially caught in the open, Curtin and Crawford are quickly cut down by Kiowa bullets and arrows. With no other options at hand, Britt Johnson draws the large bowie knife he keeps in a scabbard on his belt and, after a heart-wrenching few milliseconds, dispatches his beloved horse with the large steel blade. The hulking animal falls where it had stood, and Johnson takes what sparse cover he can find behind the animal's corpse. Now, aside from his small dog, Britt Johnson is the only remaining member of the camp left alive. From their vantage point roughly a mile and a half away, the team of ranch hands hauling freight to Weatherford can only watch as the fight unfolds, afraid of drawing the much larger Kiowa force's ire upon themselves. They watch, awestruck, as Britt Johnson now fights for his very life in a battle that he very likely knows is lost. However, Johnson fights on with the fury of a man possessed. In a momentary lull in the attack, he scrambles to the bodies of his comrades and procures their firearms and ammunition, before retaking his position behind the body of his horse and continuing to pour fire into the ranks of the Kiowa. With seemingly robotic efficiency, Johnson continues to fire and reload, methodically picking off his attackers as the relentless succession of charges continues. No one can know what thoughts crossed the mind of Britt Johnson during these lonesome, fearful moments. It is a safe assumption, however, that the memories of his beloved wife and children, now only a few dozen miles away, flood his mind. So, too, might have the memories of his time with the tribes, the killing of his son, and the promises of the disaffected warriors to exact their revenge. Though no one can know his thoughts in his final minutes, Britt Johnson's actions now become the stuff of Texas legend. As the Kiowa warriors dart around him like a swarm of enraged hornets, Johnson gives no quarter and asks for none. Shot after shot rings out, deafening all within earshot as the ground seems to quake with the rumble of the horse's hooves. Finally, though by what means we are unsure, Britt Johnson is struck by either a bullet or an arrow and dealt a mortal wound. Though the onlooking men of the freight hauling detail are unable to discern the moment at which Johnson is killed, they witness the Kiowa swarm his position and know that all is lost for the brave lone cowboy. Hours later, they venture forth to the site of the battle, assured the Kiowa have now left the area. What they find bespeaks a fight and an aftermath that, even on the bleeding edge of the Texas frontier, was unique in both its brutality and its ruthlessness. They find the bodies of Dennis Cureton and Paint Crawford where they had fallen, the tops of both their heads freshly scalped. They see the body of Johnson's horse, prostrate in its last act of service, riddled with bullets and pincushioned with arrows. Behind the body of the horse, they find Britt Johnson. He has been terribly mutilated, with his face gruesomely disfigured, scalped, and eviscerated. So, too, has the body of his small but eternally faithful dog, found shoved into Johnson's torso. However, in a testament to Johnson's commitment to fight until the end, 173 cartridges are found scattered around his body. To the men investigating the site, and in the eye of posterity, this is a near unbelievable amount of firepower for one man to have unleashed during a fight that was all but assuredly lost before it even began. In the end, the bodies of Britt Johnson, Dennis Cureton, and Paint Crawford are buried in a common grave next to the road near which they fell. A small marker with all three of their names is left at the spot, which is today marked by an official Texas Historic Site marker. Though he was not afforded a major affair for a funeral and was meant to suffer some of the worst indignities wrought upon American citizens within its tumultuous history, Britt Johnson is remembered as a Texas legend and an example to all of what selflessness, determination, and bravery really mean. For their part, the Kiowa would go on to retreat to the northwest, to the vast open plains. Here, they would again join forces with the Comanche in the ensuing 4 years in what would come to be known to history as the Red River War. This war would ultimately spell the beginning of the end for both the Kiowa and the Comanche, two powerful tribes that had been ravaged for decades by warfare and disease. But the many tales of the Red River War, as well as the full story of Britt Johnson's one-man ventures to reclaim his family, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. May 27th, 1831. Present-day southern Kansas. A group of New Mexico-based merchants are gathered in a tight cluster, making their way southwest down the Cimarron River. They are nervous, with an unspoken tension pervading the air that surrounds their small party. They have stopped to take a respite from the late spring heat, having just completed the trading they had come so far to engage in. But here, in the open expanses of the prairie, business was not always just business. Things here on the southern plains could, and often did, devolve quickly into overt, horrific violence. It was not wholly uncommon for an enterprising, overly optimistic merchant to venture out into these lands with hopes of brokering highly profitable trades and solidifying lucrative relationships with the rulers of this harsh, unremitting territory, the Comanche. Many of these hopeful capitalists were simply never seen again. Some returned wealthy men, some returned traumatized survivors of Comanche wrath. These merchants, though, had managed to broker mutually beneficial relationships with the Comanche that had lasted for decades by this point in the early 19th century. They had occupied the territories of what is now the state of New Mexico and was then known as New Spain for generations, nearly as long as the Comanche. In the preceding century and a half, the Comanche had unleashed a torrent of violence across what are now the states of Kansas, Colorado, Oklahoma, Texas, and New Mexico. Their motivations were in part retribution, payback for their cruel treatment at the hands of neighboring tribes like the Cheyenne and Blackfoot, and in part ambition. They, like the Spanish to the south, were intent on capturing as much of the wide-open expanses of the American frontier as possible. But for all their reputation as warfighters and empire builders, they were also incredibly adept traders. Of course, the threat of mortal violence is a powerful bargaining chip, but the Comanche prided themselves on being knowledgeable and formidable negotiators and bartering for the goods they desired. These New Mexico merchants had largely avoided the violence of Comanche expansion by providing them with a reliable, sustainable source of trade for the goods they valued but could not produce themselves. The Comanche possessed the largest collective swath of North American territory of any tribe on the continent. They were rich in land, buffalo meat, buffalo hides, and horses. But they had no tradition in pottery nor weaving, nor any access to metals such as copper and iron that they highly prized. The iron was highly prized for use as arrow and spearheads, while the copper was often beaten into discs and worn as jewelry on necklaces, bracelets, or woven into the long braids of thick hair the Comanche prided themselves on. Many of the paints that they could procure from traders were of more vibrant hues and resilient finishes than the ones they made themselves from natural dyes and animal fats. Cotton shirts, hats, jewelry, and of course, firearms were all prized to differing degrees by the Comanche, and, more often than not, the Comanche bartered with men like this small group of weary, weather-beaten traders who were often comprised of small bands of family members or close friends. They were the descendants of Spanish settlers who had often intermarried into the surrounding tribes. Their way of life in the desolate expanses of New Mexico and West Texas was a perpetually difficult, dangerous affair. But after peace with the Comanche had been brokered by Governor Juan Bautista de Anza in 1778, trade between the Spanish descendant settlers of New Spain and the Comanche began in earnest. Before long, a regular system of trade was established where intrepid bands of traders ventured out into the no-man's land that was Comancheria. Most were men from hard backgrounds who found little comparable opportunity anywhere else. Many died hard, horrendous deaths at the hands of the Comanche or other tribes like the Apache or the Kiowa. Many were robbed, many were killed, and many robbed and killed others. They developed their own fringe society away from the norms of New Spain or the burgeoning power of the United States. They became known as Comancheros for their proclivity and aptitude for dealing with a tribe whose mere mention could send waves of panic through settlements all through Texas and Mexico. This particular group of Comancheros here on the Cimarron River had traveled a long way to conduct their business, and now only hoped to get home with their profits as soon as possible. They spoke briefly in their huddled formation about the trades that they had made, the profits they had taken, and their unanimous desire to put distance between themselves and the party of Comanche they had just traded with. To a man, the small party was aware that there was nothing to stop the Comanche from trailing them for a while, only to kill them all, recoup the items they had traded away, and walk away with little to no consequence. But just as they were about to resume their course southward, one of them spots a figure only a few hundred yards in the distance. Even at this distance, it is clear the figure approaching them on horseback is not a Comanche. As the rider comes toward them, he attempts to wave them down to engage in conversation. As he draws nearer, it becomes apparent that he is an American. In fact, though the Comancheros would have no way of knowing it, this was one of the most well-known and well-traveled Americans alive at the time. While the Comancheros knew the vast expanses of their homeland like the backs of their hands, they did not know, nor in many instances could they scarcely imagine, the scope or extremity of this American man's travels in the previous decade. Barring but a few possible exceptions, this lone rider had seen more of the North American continent than anyone alive at the time. He had come from upstate New York, worked on freighter ships that sailed the expanses of the Great Lakes, and made his way to the burgeoning city of St. Louis. From there, he had traveled from the Dakotas to the Rocky Mountains, the Mojave Desert, the missions of Southern California, the San Joaquin Valley, the Sierra Nevadas, San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and then all the way north through present-day Oregon and Washington into Canada. He had survived the deadliest attacks on record, from the Arikara in South Dakota to the Mojave in California to the Umpqua in Oregon. He had worked with and under some of the most legendary names in mountain man history, men like William Ashley, Hugh Glass, Jim Bridger, William Wolfskill, Milton Sublette, William Sublette, Joseph Meek, and Bill Williams, to name but a few. Most of the men he had traveled and worked with, though, had died violent deaths in their pursuit of fortune in the wilds of a continent that they, in the initial throes of manifest destiny, believed to be rightfully and inherently theirs. He had narrowly survived a vicious mauling by an enraged grizzly bear, one that necessitated his ear being sewn back onto his head via crude frontier surgery without the benefit of anesthetic. This incident left him permanently scarred and saw him wear his hair longer from then on in order to hide the scars. He had been detained by Mexican officials in California who were in fact rightfully dubious as to the intentions of these curiously dressed Americans who claimed they were merely passing through their bountiful territory. Through it all, he had remained steadfast in his faith as a Methodist and his ardent commitment to the venture capitalism he hoped would provide for his family. His name was Jedediah Strong Smith. Just the year before, he had made his way back to St. Louis, cashed in on the pelts he had collected at the price of so many lives lost and miles covered, and vowed never to enter the mountains again. He purchased a sizable home on what is now Broadway Street in St. Louis and sent a banknote for $1,500 back to Ohio in order to purchase land neighboring one of his brother's farms. 3 of his younger brothers had come to live with him in St. Louis, where he hoped to be able to provide them with better economic opportunity than he had found upon his initial forays from home at their age. He repeatedly swore in numerous correspondence to family and friends that his days in the mountains were done. His mother had recently passed away, and the incessant internal tumult that had hounded him since he left home, another sentiment that often litters the journal entries and letters of Jedediah Smith, incessantly harped at his conscience that he should travel to his family's new homestead in Ohio to care for his aging father. But in the time since returning to St. Louis in 1829 and the spring of 1831, the incessant wanderlust that had driven him to such distances began to drown out the guilt that he felt for his extended departure from his home and family. He had written to the Secretary of War, John Eaton, requesting to be made part of a proposed military expedition into the Rocky Mountains. To be sure, there would be few men in the world more qualified to lead the expedition than Jedediah Smith. But Smith never received a response from Eaton, and the expedition never materialized. Smith then began to look towards the prospect of publishing his memoirs, along with the numerous maps he had compiled during his travels. Even throughout the most dire of times in his travels, Smith had, with at least some measure of consistency, recorded his thoughts in a series of journals. In addition, he was a skilled cartographer whose maps were accurate and reliable. He hoped to illuminate the entirety of the eastern seaboard and perhaps even Europe with tales of his exploits complete with the maps that he had drawn. To do this, though, he felt he needed to add at least one trip to his already expansive list of expeditions. The town of Santa Fe, in what is now the state of New Mexico, had been growing in population and reputation as a trading post and way stop on the trip to California. And so, after not hearing back from Secretary of War Eaton, Smith decided to sign on with an expedition to Santa Fe with William Sublette and David Jackson. The 3 men would lead a wagon train carrying roughly $20,000 in goods to Santa Fe. Smith also enlisted Samuel Parkman to assist in arranging his writings and maps into a publishable manuscript, as well as to polish his Spanish skills so that he might decipher some of the Spanish terms recorded in Smith's diaries with more accuracy. The trail from St. Louis to Santa Fe was well traveled, and even in 1831 was considered well established and comparatively safe. Few lives were lost annually to either privation or attacks from natives. In comparison to the trips Smith had been making for the past decade, this endeavor would have seemed to be a relatively easy affair, despite the distance being over 1,000 miles. The wagon train, complete with 83 men, left for Santa Fe in the spring of 1831, in high spirits with aspirations of completing a timely, profitable trip. They headed southwest, and initially, all had gone well. Then, trouble began to befall the party. First, on May 19th, a company clerk who had long worked for Sublette and Jackson, a man recorded only as Mentor, was murdered by Pawnee warriors when he wandered off from the main party near the Pawnee River, a tributary of the Arkansas River. Then, the water began to run out. By May 27th, the party was completely out of water for both men and livestock. All the established water sources on the trail had thus far proven dried up. On that morning, much the same as they had for the previous few mornings, Smith and his cohorts would pair up and fan out in different directions from their camp in an attempt to find any viable water sources. Smith and his partner, a man named Fitzpatrick, headed south on that morning, hoping to find a spring on the north side of the Cimarron River. The Cimarron itself flows through several mineral deposits, rendering the water not potable as it is too salty. However, several springs lie nearby the river which do produce drinkable water. Smith and Fitzpatrick thought perhaps they were getting close that morning when they had happened upon a depression in the flat landscape that harbored damp ground at its lowest point. Smith directed Fitzpatrick to stay there and attempt to dig for water in the depression, while he rode ahead to see if there were any springs nearby. While Fitzpatrick began digging, Smith headed off further south. Within a few miles, he was out of sight of Fitzpatrick. Within a few more, he came into sight of this band of Comancheros. The Comancheros are alarmed. A legendary mountain man lopes his horse towards them, speaking to them in broken Spanish, asking where water might be found. To the Comancheros, he presents a clear and present danger not only to himself, but to them as well. The Comancheros offer him no water, and only point him towards a spring a few miles away. The Comancheros offer him no water, and only point him towards a spring a few miles away. They also inform him in concise, broken English that the Comanche were nearby and that he would not be able to avoid them no matter his next move. Furthermore, he is informed that he must make the next move immediately, as he presented a liability to the Comancheros party. Should the Comanche find him in their company, they might suppose him to be a spy and kill them all. This was not a risk the Comancheros were willing to take for the lonesome and now doubtless fear-stricken American. He was on his own. Seeing no better course of action, Jedediah Smith continues on in the direction of the spring the Comancheros had informed him of. He departs from the Comancheros, resolutely making his way forward and mustering all the courage and wherewithal he might bring to bear. He and his party would surely die without the water, and while he knew there was a very real possibility that the Comanche would usher him into an even more immediate end, Smith saw little other course of action. As the Comancheros watched from a distance, he makes his way further south, to what is now known as Wagon Bed Spring in southwestern Kansas. Just before he reaches the spring, a band of 15 to 20 Comanches come upon him. They have spotted Smith before he even departed the Comanchero party, and spent the time it took him to ride to the spring discussing in Spanish what they would do with this trespassing American. For all intents and purposes, Smith and his company were indeed trespassing. In fact, the entire trade they had been plying for the past decade or more was technically illegal and in violation of numerous treaties that forbade hunting and trapping in native or foreign lands. The Comanche, though, are not concerned with the legalities of any particular treaty on this day. They see him as an intolerable interloper, a representative of a people who have sought to invade their lands. Also, they may have seen him as sport. Smith does his best to stay calm, hailing the Comanche with a smile and signing to them in the ubiquitous sign language of the plains that he was merely passing through and hoping to slake his thirst as well as his horses. He searches the faces of the Comanche warriors who surround him, the notoriously stout and rugged-looking ponies, striking such an odd juxtaposition against their master's formidable reputation. The Comanche, too, look different than any of the other tribes Smith has encountered on the plains. They themselves are shorter and stockier than their northern plains counterparts, with, especially at this time in the early 19th century, little of the cosmetic adornments of their plains cohorts, such as war bonnets or white-boned breastplates. The Comanche, in particular, cut a stark, terrifying figure, even for the most experienced of travelers on the frontier. And, in accordance with their reputation, no warrior among them returns Smith's smile or salutations. For a few tense, terrifying seconds, the two parties stare silently at each other. Then, the Comanche begin to encircle Smith, moving into their positions while taunting Smith's horse, trying to spook him into throwing his rider. Smith, for his part, still attempts to broker some kind of peace that might allow him to trade some of his valuables for his safe passage back to his party. But as the situation rapidly develops, it becomes clear that the Comanche are not interested in any deal. Just as the Comanche have Smith half surrounded in a crescent moon formation, a shot rings out from a Comanche rifle. A lead ball tears into Jedediah Smith's right shoulder, as the noise simultaneously startles his horse, causing both animal and rider to wheel about 180 degrees. Smith had laid his Kentucky rifle across his lap before being accosted by the Comanche, and as his horse turned, Smith managed to shoulder the weapon and return fire, killing one of the warriors, whom later accounts would describe as a chief. As the Comanche warrior's body slumps from his mount and thuds to the hard Kansas dirt, Jedediah Smith reaches for one of the two single-shot pistols he keeps tucked in his belt. In the seconds it takes to accomplish this, the remaining Comanche warriors, now fully enraged at the killing of one of their own, pounce upon Smith, knocking him off of his horse. As soon as he hits the ground, it is all but certain Jedediah Smith knows he is going to die. The Comanche have spent so much effort attaining their empire in the southern plains, largely because of the immense buffalo herds that reliably roamed its expanses. In order to kill the gigantic, aggressive, and fleet-of-foot buffalo, the Comanche often employed the use of 12 to 14-foot spears that could be used to stab a buffalo from a distance. The animal would be struck under the ribs, so that the most damage might be done to the target's internal organs. The same tactic was employed against human enemy targets. From atop their stout ponies, the remaining Comanche drove their lances into the torso of America's most legendary, accomplished mountain man. The attack is incredibly swift and unspeakably violent, as the Comanche mock and club the dying man. The only mercy for the unfortunate Smith is that it is all over in a matter of seconds. As his body lies lifeless, covered in blood and plains dust, the Comanche strap their dead compatriot to his horse, take Smith's horse, his guns, and valuables, and leave him to the buzzards and the summer sun. Jedediah Smith's body would never be found, and it would be days later until the Comancheros would encounter the sublet Jackson party on the Santa Fe Trail. Here, they would produce Smith's pistols and rifle to his grief-stricken younger brother, Austin. The Comancheros had traded the Comanche for the items after their murder of Smith and acquired the Comanche's side of the story. They corroborated this with their own eyewitness accounts, and these accounts were relayed back to Smith's elderly widower father in Ohio in a letter from Austin Smith. The letter, heart-wrenching in its revelations even 2 centuries later, reads as follows. Your son Jedediah was killed on the Cimarron the 27th of May, on his way to Santa Fe by the Kermanch engines. His party was in distress for water, and he had gone alone in search of the above river, which he found when he was attacked by 15 or 20 of them. They succeeded in alarming his animal, not daring to fire on him so long as they kept face to face. So soon as his horse turned, they fired, and wounded him in the shoulder. He then fired his gun and killed their head chief, it is supposed they rushed upon him and dispatched him. An obituary would be published for him that fall in the Illinois Intelligencer, but no mention of his death was made in his adopted hometown of St. Louis's local publication. His memoirs and maps would not only not be published, but his legacy and legend would be largely forgotten by the public for the better part of a century and a half. Jedediah Smith never married, nor had any children. In his brief 32 years, he had managed to incessantly, seemingly impulsively, pursue his intentions of wealth and security to ends that had thus far been unheard of in American history. To add even more to the decidedly unserendipitous nature of Smith's final expedition, the remainder of the party on the Santa Fe Trail, including Sublette, Jackson, and Smith's younger brother Austin, were all able to find water and eventually make their way safely to Santa Fe. From here, Austin Smith would pursue his own successful career in mercantilism, and Sublette and Jackson would continue on to California in order to return with a large remuda of horses and mules to trade and sell in Santa Fe and Missouri. In the entirety of the year of 1831, the only lives lost on the Santa Fe Trail would be those of the unfortunate Minter at the hands of the Pawnee, and Smith at the hands of the Comanche. Life in the Old West was always hard, and often cheap. The violence and hardships that befell people of all races, religions, and backgrounds could be startlingly indiscriminate and stunningly swift. And so it was that one of the most expansive, interesting lives in American history was snuffed out. Despite all his exploits, he found himself but a stranger in a strange land, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. But the annals of Old West history are replete with far more stories of Smith, his fellow mountain men, as well as the countless natives and settlers they interacted with. Tales of lives lost, fortunes gained, and miles traveled are more numerous than the stars in the open western sky. Northern Wyoming, December 21st, 1866. As battle cries and screams of agony ring out all around him, 32-year-old Adolf Metzger is in a desperate fight for his life. Tucked back into the scarcely discernible shelter of a crevice amidst a field of boulders, the young German-born immigrant fights ferociously, swinging his weapon with all of his might as guttural exhortations fly unconsciously from his lips. His attackers, who have all but laid waste to his comrades, are a collection of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, hundreds strong, fighting under the command of the legendary Red Cloud. They wield bows, arrows, lances, knives, and tomahawks and advance upon their ensconced quarry with the myopic fury of a hungry pride of lions. Metzger, for his part, wields only a small brass instrument, a bugle, that he desperately swings as dozens of lances and arrows berate his position. To a random passerby, this spectacle would doubtless appear curious, if not slightly comical, were it not for the deadly serious consequences of the fight at hand. But, as curious as the sight might be, it is anything but a random encounter. Adolf Metzger is a soldier in the United States Army, serving in the 2nd Cavalry Regiment, C Company. At 5 feet 8 inches tall, with brown hair and blue eyes, he cuts a similar figure to many of his comrades, who now lie cold in death around his position. He serves as the company bugler, a critical position in a time before radio communication. Metzger's job is to belt out the appropriate tunes on the bugle to denote attacks, retreats, and various maneuvers. The U.S. Army has determined that buglers need both hands free in order to properly execute their duties, and thus, the only weapon that Metzger has left is the diminutive brass instrument, with which he now makes a desperate last stand. Though he now stands here incurring the consequences of the United States government's repeated offenses against the Northern Plains nations, Metzger is but a poor soldier, at the mercy of his commanders and his duty. 6 months earlier, in June of 1866, the 2nd Cavalry, under the command of Colonel Henry B. Carrington, had ridden out of Fort Laramie in what is today southeastern Wyoming and into what is known as the Powder River Country with orders to protect immigrants traveling on the Bozeman Trail. A treaty had been agreed to with most of the powerful Northern Plains nations in 1851, including the Cheyenne, Lakota, Arapaho, Assiniboine, Mandan, Hidatsa, and Crow tribes. Signed in the very fort Carrington had ridden out of, it is known as the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. The treaty had designated this area in the Powder River Country as belonging to the Crow tribe, and guaranteed it immunity from incursion by either rival tribes or American settlers. However, a decade and a half of dwindling buffalo herds and increasing encroachment from westbound immigrants has driven the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho into more and more desperate straits. Fed up with the lack of trustworthiness exhibited by the United States government, the mighty Red Cloud has gathered a formidable army of highly motivated warriors intent not only on forestalling westward expansion, but on eliminating every soldier, settler, and rival tribe from their territory for good. While many of the soldiers now serving in the post-Civil War Army are indeed accustomed to combat and the hardships of life on the trail, none of them, nor their superiors, have seen anything like the warfare being waged upon them by Red Cloud. For the next few months, after their arrival in the Powder River Country, as they labored and constructed the fort that would be their home, the soldiers dealt with incessant attacks from warriors riding under the command of Red Cloud. Even after the fort was completed, Colonel Carrington was reticent to send any patrols outside of its walls in order to engage and deter the constant onslaught of piecemeal attacks. As the casualties mounted and the frustration amongst the ranks grew, Carrington's subordinate officers, most notably Captain William Fetterman, began to insist more and more vociferously that the only way to stop the attacks was to take the fight to Red Cloud and his warriors. Carrington and Fetterman had both served in the Union Army during the Civil War, though both men had had wildly different experiences throughout the conflict. While both had served honorably, Carrington, a Yale-educated officer and highly regarded as a masterful bureaucrat, had not seen combat on the front lines. Instead, he had solidified his reputation as a tireless organizer and, by war's end, had become head of a Union spy ring being run out of Indianapolis. Carrington, as well as his superiors, saw this excursion into the Powder River Country as an opportunity to garner the 42-year-old a measure of actual combat experience and pad his otherwise exemplary record. Whether due to his disposition, inexperience, or simply differing discernment of the situation at hand, Carrington had repeatedly denied his officers permission to pursue the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. By December of 1866, this had caused an increasing level of discontent amongst nearly everyone ensconced within the timber confines of the fort. While no major engagements had taken place, it seemed to the inhabitants of the fort that one or two of them were turning up dead with alarming regularity. Among the most vocal proponents of taking up a more offensive course of action against the native attackers is Captain Fetterman. In stark contrast to his superior officer, Captain Fetterman has seen frontline action in the Civil War. He had participated in the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, as well as Sherman's March. After the conclusion of the Civil War, Fetterman had stayed in the U.S. Army with the intentions of becoming a career officer. Though Fetterman's father had served as an officer in the Army, he had been orphaned as a young man and in his late teens denied entrance into West Point. Though he had gone on to assemble an impressive military resume, the combined lack of both a familial and educational pedigree imbued the captain with a burning sense of ambition. Though it was not an uncommon exhortation amongst American officers on the plains, Fetterman had repeatedly claimed that with a force of 80 men, he could wipe out the entire Sioux nation. Finally, after being ordered by General George Cooke to take the offensive against the murderous and insulting attacks, Carrington began to take a more aggressive approach against Red Cloud and his warriors. On December 6th, Carrington received word that a wagon train of woodcutters was under attack. The woodcutters, men whose job of venturing out into the nearby woods to procure timber was quickly becoming one of the most dangerous professions on the frontier, were roughly 4 miles west of the relative safety of the fort walls. Immediately grasping the gravity of the situation, Carrington ordered Fetterman to lead a company of cavalry and a squad of mounted infantry directly to the scene, while he led another attachment north to cut off the retreat of the warriors. Carrington had, in fact, made tactically astute decisions. However, 2 young lieutenants named Drummond and Bingham had led 3 other troops in pursuit of a small group of warriors, only to wind up in an ambush. Drummond and 2 others had managed to escape, narrowly making it back to rejoin their commander with several of Red Cloud's warriors in hot pursuit. Carrington had then found himself and the remainder of his contingent surrounded by roughly 100 warriors. However, with the arrival of Fetterman and his backup, the attacking warriors were compelled to retreat north, disappearing over the rolling hills. As Carrington and his men re-entered the walls of Fort Kearny, it was all too obvious to those of them that had seen combat in the Civil War that this, combat on the open plains, would be an altogether different business. Those who had never experienced combat before this were chilled to the bone by the realization that they were all a very long way from home, with limited support, surrounded by their enemy and their enemy's own land. It must have seemed to many that their saving grace would indeed be their faction's superior technology. While U.S. Army soldiers who had fought the Plains tribes prior to the Civil War had been largely armed with single-shot rifles and early iterations of the Colt revolver, these men were equipped with weapons developed largely over the course of the preceding 6 years. The officers among them generally carried the Model 1860 Colt or 1858 Remington 44 caliber revolvers. The typical infantryman carried the Springfield Model 1863 rifle musket chambered in .58 caliber, while the typical cavalryman was armed with either a Spencer Model 1860 52 caliber or Model 1865 50 caliber 7-shot repeating carbine. The warriors fighting under Red Cloud are largely armed with only their traditional bows, lances, shields, and war clubs, with only a few warriors armed with 44 caliber revolvers and single-shot flintlock rifles. This discrepancy in firepower is, it is now obvious to most, the only thing keeping them alive here in the unforgiving austerity of the snow-laden Powder River country. In their after-action reports, Carrington and Fetterman concurred that the lack of discipline and organization exhibited by the troops during the engagement was indeed cause for great concern. Fetterman commented that this Indian war has become a hand-to-hand fight requiring the utmost caution. The one man in the fort with significant experience in fighting the tribes of the northern plains was the 62-year-old legendary mountain man, trapper, scout, explorer, and frontiersman Jim Bridger, who served as a lead scout for Carrington. Bridger, who for weeks had observed the increasing difficulties of the young soldiers in dealing with the attacks from the native warriors, remarked to the general that, "Your soldiers don't know anything about fighting Indians." Carrington had immediately redoubled the training of his troops, drilling them incessantly and making abundantly clear to the officers, time and again, that caution must be exercised in all engagements, attacks must be limited, and all maneuvers made in the interest of minimizing their men's exposure to danger. The number of guards on duty was doubled, and all of the 50 remaining horses of the fort were to remain saddled from dawn to dark in case of an immediate need. On December 19th, the drilling and precautions seemed to have paid off when General Carrington had ordered a captain named Powell to assist a group of woodcutters under attack. Following his orders with scrupulous detail, Powell had indeed managed to force the attacking warriors into retreat. He had not allowed any pursuit of the warriors and had returned safely with the woodcutting detail in tow. The following day, Carrington had refused the request of Captain Fetterman and Captain Brown, another veteran officer, to take a contingent of well-armed civilian employees of the fort on a raid to disperse or capture a Lakota village situated roughly 50 miles away on the Tongue River. This, almost certainly, saved the lives of all the proposed participants, as the village was much larger and much more ready to make war than the captains realized. However, the cavalrymen's respite from the cold of death would be tragically all too brief. It would be only a day later, on December 21st at about 10 a.m., when General Carrington was alerted of a band of warriors yet again harassing a party of woodcutters. The morning had been clear and cold, and while another attack had been expected, most had hoped their advancing from the fort might come in the comparatively warmer hours of the afternoon. By all accounts of those present, Carrington gave Captain Fetterman clear orders not to pursue the warriors over Lodge Trail Ridge that lay to the north of the fort. He was only to proceed northwest, reinforce the security detail accompanying the woodcutting party, and return. Under no circumstances, Carrington ordered, are you to pursue over the ridge to the north. Captain Fetterman departed the fort not long after 10 a.m. Captain Brown, soon to receive orders to leave the fort and loath to pass up one last opportunity at avenging his fallen countrymen, volunteered to go as well. Issuing the call to advance outside the gates had been Adolph Metzger, whose steady intonations, hide a growing unease rapidly taking hold of his nerves. Marching forward under the directives of Metzger's bugle is the largest relief force yet sent out by Carrington, including a detachment of infantrymen on foot. Leading a small detachment of cavalry assigned to support these men on their way to the battlefield is Lieutenant George Drummond, who only days earlier had narrowly escaped death by impetuously pursuing a party of warriors into the ambush that had killed Lieutenant Bingham and another soldier. As the gates to the fort closed, Carrington retreated to his quarters, by all accounts relatively confident of Fetterman's fidelity to his orders, but concerned about the discipline of Lieutenant Bingham, considering his actions on the previous few days. However, with limited men and limited time, he still felt that Bingham was more of an asset than a liability. However, within the hour, before 11 a.m., Carrington would be alerted that Fetterman had, despite his explicit orders, pursued the party of attacking warriors to the north. Within the confines of the fort, the situation is maddeningly inexplicable to the general. Later accounts of the battle from Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho sources shed light on what might have provoked an attack that should have been explicitly prohibited under direct order. Among the warriors attacking the wagon train on this icy northern plains morning is a young warrior with oddly light skin and wavy hair. He had been spotted before by the soldiers and woodcutters alike, standing out not only for his appearance, but his unyielding ferocity. Again and again, when other warriors had retreated, or worse yet, fallen in death, the young man had proven indefatigable in assaulting his enemy. His own people, too, were increasingly impressed with his bravery and selflessness. Though still in his early 20s, the young man was beginning to cultivate a reputation as a fearless warrior and trustworthy leader. As a child, because of his hair, he had been known as Curly. Now, he is known amongst his people as Tisonka Whitco, or Crazy Horse. Crazy Horse and company, upon seeing the arrival of Captain Fetterman and his men, see yet another opportunity to employ one of their favorite tactics, a feigned retreat. In hopes of drawing the army officer's ire and enticing him to follow their feigned retreat into an ambush, Crazy Horse hurls repeated insults at Fetterman and his men, cursing them in English and striking threatening poses as a challenge. Finally, in either desperation or disgust, Crazy Horse had turned his back to the soldiers, dropped his leather leggings, and mooned them. Whether or not this insult is indeed the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, Fetterman's men did indeed give chase. One possibility later proffered by researchers is that it was in fact Grumman, again at the mercy of his own vainglorious impulses, who broke ranks and began to lead the charge. As the pursuit carried on northward, Grummond and the bulk of the force pulled ahead of Fetterman, Brown, and the remainder of the force by several hundred yards. As they proceeded over the crest of Lodge Trail Ridge, however, they are met with what must have been a sickeningly bone-chilling sight. Thousands of warriors stood ready to meet them. The attack was not sprung until Grumman and his party were near the bottom of the ridge, with Fetterman and Brown between them and the fort. At first, an attempt to stand their ground is made. Then, quickly seeing the futility of this approach, Grumman, leading the contingent of troops furthest down the hill, begins to lead a fighting retreat up the steep slope, intending to reunite with Fetterman. Now, as the battle rages on, the attacking Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho have managed to separate the two forces further. Though he fights valiantly and attempts to lead the men who have followed him back up the hill, Grummond is soon cut down in vicious hand-to-hand combat. As the infantry desperately slip and slide as they attempt to climb their way up the hill, they too are cut down in brutal fashion by arrows, clubs, and spears. Soon, the white snow of the hillside is stained in large swatches of blood and viscera. Fetterman and Brown lead the men still alive under their command to an outcropping of boulders, from where they presumably intend to hold out until reinforcements arrive. They squeeze off round after round, desperately trying to issue orders over the din of rifle fire, war cries, and the screams of the wounded and dying. It is mere minutes, however, before Captain Fetterman is cut down by a hulking Sioux warrior named American Horse, with a devastating blow from his nail-studded war club, after which the warrior leaps from his horse and cuts the American's throat. The outcropping is overrun in short order, with troopers falling all around in their final throes of agony as they are brutalized by attacking warriors. Knowing the fate that now awaits him, Captain Brown fires off every remaining round in his revolver, saving the last for himself. Before he can be overtaken and subjected to the torturous demise of his comrades, Captain Brown falls dead by his own hand. Among the last left alive is Adolf Metzger, who now knows he has but moments left to live. As the hellish reality unfolds around him, perhaps his mind indeed recalls a brief synopsis of his life. Scenes he will never see again. The German countryside of his youth, the countless charges he had survived during the previous few years, and doubtless recollections of his worried mother and beloved, long-suffering wife, Frederica, whom he had married while still on campaign in the summer of 1864. This respite, though, must last only moments. As Metzger continues to swing his instrument, the bugle incurring dents as his body incurs slashes and stab wounds. He backs further into the crevice, now with no room left to retreat. The scene over the next few minutes is one of unabated brutality, as Metzger too is slashed, cut, and bludgeoned until he finally falls dead on the cold Wyoming ground. The last American soldier left alive during this engagement, one that will come to be known as the Fetterman Massacre, or Fetterman's Fight, is now gone. To the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, the success of their tactics is inarguable. Before this battle, a Sioux medicine man had reported having a dream, in which he had held 100 dead blue-coat soldiers in each hand. In the lore of the Sioux, the battle is known as the Battle of the 100 in the Hand. This engagement would be the most costly ever inflicted upon the U.S. Army until a full decade later, when many of the same warriors would decimate Custer's forces at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. For Red Cloud, the utter devastation wrought upon the U.S. Army in this engagement is but a pretense of things to come. The Battle of the 100 in the Hand is but one engagement in what will come to be known as Red Cloud's War, the most successful military campaign ever led by native forces against the United States Army. But the epic tale of how the mighty Sioux chief managed to bring to bear the power of his leadership and his people's resolve in one of the greatest military campaigns in the history of the Old West, as well as the story of how General Carrington responded to the tragic massacre of his men, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. British Columbia, Canada, June 16, 1811. Aboard the American fur ship known as the Tonquin, fur trader James Lewis lies below deck, mortally wounded. His breathing is labored, and he strains to listen to the native warriors that are just now pulling their long dugout canoes up next to the hulking vessel. He does not know their language, and thus he does not know what they are saying. But he knows why they are here, and James Lewis knows what is about to happen. The chilly waters that surround the vessel situated in Clayoquot Sound were seemingly empty just minutes ago. Now, they seem to swarm with war canoes, dozens of them, filled with angered Clayoquot warriors. Soon, the plodding of moccasined footsteps begins to cause a low rumble, as if a thunderstorm is brewing somewhere far away. Lewis begins to feel sick, the noxious effects of his physical state and his psychological distress. But his resolve remains steady. His gaze drops momentarily, and he stares blankly into the roomful of gunpowder kegs outside of which he lies, propped up against one of the sturdy wooden walls of the ship. He again studies the line of dark powder stretching from his position into the room. He is tired. The night before had been the longest of his still young life, in which his thoughts had drifted from his current situation to his family and friends at home, whom he knows he will never see again. He had also had much time to ponder the events of the previous few days, and just how he had come to be here, alone, below decks of this expensive and well-traveled ship. Lewis had been part of a crew of American, French, Canadian, and native fur traders under the employ of the legendary business and real estate mogul, John Jacob Astor. They had traveled to this distant locale in the hopes of trading with the natives for the valuable beaver pelts that were, at this time in the 19th century, a highly profitable commodity. For the next few days, they had anchored offshore of these idyllic lands and bartered a number of profitable trades with the locals. Though the men on board the Tonquin and the local Cloyoquiot had respective origins thousands of miles away from each other, they were well aware of each other's existence. Though America as a nation extends only to the Mississippi River at this point in the early 19th century, the American fur trade is a globalized industry. The fashionable beaver felt stovepipe hat at this time is all the rage in Europe, as well as the more cosmopolitan urban centers in America. Cafes, parlors, and street corners are all replete with young men sporting their most stylish new headgear. In what might be considered both the height of irony and a wonder of a worldwide supply chain, it is the fashionable fancies of the European upper classes that drive the day-to-day lives and livelihoods of people more than half a world away. Throughout the entirety of North America, fur trappers roam the rivers and streams, hoping to ensnare the valuable animals in their steel traps and send their bounties out to market by way of St. Louis or Santa Fe. And on the open seas, American vessels routinely made the treacherous journey around Cape Horn and up the west coast of North America to the Pacific Northwest, where they traded for furs with local natives. Within a few decades' time, the entire system would implode, as changing fashions and waning beaver populations would prove too much for the market to bear. However, in 1811, there is scarcely a more profitable trade on the whole of the continent, and men are driven to great lengths in their quests to build their fortunes. Perhaps most prominent among these men capitalizing on the fur boom is Johann Jakob Astor, better known as John Jacob Astor, a German-born American immigrant who had capitalized on the Jay Treaty that was signed by the United States and Great Britain in 1794. The treaty opened new markets in the Great Lakes region as well as in Canada. Astor signed a contract with the Northwest Company based in Montreal. Astor would import the furs from Montreal to New York, and then ship them to Europe to be purchased by hat manufacturers. By the turn of the 19th century, he had amassed a fortune of roughly $250,000, over $6 million by today's standards when accounting for inflation. However, in 1807, the U.S. Embargo Act was enacted by Congress, closing off trade with Canada and severely disrupting Astor's business dealings as his connections in Montreal were now illegal. In response, Astor obtained direct permission from President Thomas Jefferson to establish the American Fur Company, which he did in 1808. Over the next few years, Astor would use the American Fur Company, or AFC, as well as its subsidiaries, to gain control of virtually the entirety of the Great Lakes region, as well as secure several lucrative contracts. Intending to hamper his former employer in the Northwest Company, as well as the juggernaut of the industry in the Hudson's Bay Company, Astor soon began to finance expeditions to the Pacific Northwest in hopes of monopolizing the fur trade with the natives there before his rivals could gain a foothold. This had been the driving force behind Astor's purchase of the Tonquin. In 1810, Astor created the Pacific Fur Company, a subsidiary of the American Fur Company, to expand into the Northwest with intentions to both explore the territory and to establish favorable relations with the natives. Astor had purchased the Tonquin, a 290-pound bark, 96 feet in length, and outfitted to carry 22 cannons, from the Fanning and Coles Company, who had sailed the ship to China to trade for cheap goods in 1807. Astor purchased the vessel for $37,860, roughly $700,000 today, on August 23, 1810. He hired the most experienced fur traders he knew, mostly Scottish and French-Canadian voyageurs who had long plied their arduous trades amongst the natives of the Great Lakes region. And to command the ship, Astor sought out the services of a short-tempered and staunchly disciplined ex-U.S. Navy captain named Jonathan Thorne. Born in Schenectady, New York on January 8, 1779, he was the first of 15 children born to Samuel and Helena Horne. He became a midshipman in the U.S. Navy at age 21 in April of 1800. Thorne participated in the Tripolitan War, also known as the First Barbary War, in 1801. Thorne was part of a small group of volunteers that accomplished the dangerous mission of sneaking into the harbor at Tripoli, Libya, and destroying the captured American frigate known as the Philadelphia on February 16, 1804. On August 3rd of that same year, Thorne also participated in the attack on Tripoli Harbor led by Commodore Edward Preble, He was commended for his conduct during the engagement and was given command of one of the captured gunboats. While serving in the New York Navy Yard, he was promoted to the rank of full lieutenant in February 1807. At the time, Thorne was the youngest naval officer to ever command a United States naval yard. Still, despite his relatively rapid ascension within the ranks of the Navy, Thorne's correspondence to friends and family at the time betray a young man internally besieged by self-doubt and various physical ailments. Thorne would serve in the Navy until 1810, when he was granted a 2-year furlough in order to sign on with John Jacob Astor for a job as captain of the Tonquin. But as much as Astor's thought processes were logical, he would simply hire the best, most experienced men he could for each position. They lacked an overall accounting for the variability of human temperaments, perspectives, and experiences. And, unfortunately for the men embarking on the Tonquin, there were scarcely two cultures more at odds than that of Captain Thorne's disciplined Navy and that of the purely pragmatic, often romanticized voyageurs. The Tonquin set sail from New York City on September 8, 1810, carrying a crew of 34 men. They rounded Cape Horn and stopped off in Hawaii before arriving at the mouth of the Columbia River on the 22nd of March, 1811. During the entirety of the journey, Captain Thorne had proven increasingly at odds with the voyageurs. They found him wildly overbearing, while he found them slothful and disorganized. Thorne saw his obedience to the orders of Astor as his primary responsibility, while the voyageurs viewed themselves as skilled and knowledgeable tradesmen who had hired on for a job they intended to do well. However, they had no intentions nor inclinations to adhere to what they saw as the captain's overly strict policies and timelines. En route to the Pacific Northwest, Thorne's adherence to schedule was tested beyond what he considered to be reasonable bounds. On December 4, 1810, when the Tonquin had pulled into Port Egmont in the Falkland Islands in order to gather supplies and make minor repairs, 8 men had ventured into the interior of the islands in hopes of procuring more provisions. When they proved slightly tardy on their return, Thorne saw fit to sail away with the remainder of the crew and leave the 8 men stranded on the remote island. Desperate and with little other option, the 8 men struck out desperately in their rowboat in hopes of catching up with the Tonquin. After 6 exhausting hours, the men in the rowboat managed to come within sight of the Tonquin. One of the crewmen, a man named Robert Stewart, threatened to kill the captain should he not turn around to rescue the men and the rowboat. Thorne, rightfully taking the threat quite seriously, obliged to Stewart and his cohort's demands, and the 8 crewmen were subsequently rescued. While Thorne had seen the action as a necessary imposition of discipline, the trappers and crewmen, who were not military men, saw it as a dishonorable and wholly condemnable action. Thorne, for his part, had become increasingly frustrated with the laissez-faire attitude of the fur traders. He found the jovial atmosphere they created as inappropriate, dismissive, and even dangerous. By the time the Tonquin sailed into the waters of Hawaii's Kaleakua Bay on the 12th of February 1811, the crew and the captain were seemingly irreparably at odds. Though he was a stalwart disciplinarian, Thorne did see the necessity in maintaining at least some semblance of cordiality between himself and the crew. So, while in Hawaii, Thorne finally made a temporary peace between himself and the senior partner fur traders. Thorne recruited 24 Hawaiian Kanaka laborers to assist in the day-to-day work that awaited the crew of the Tonquin upon their arrival in the Pacific Northwest. The Tonquin left Hawaii behind on March 1, 1811. 3 weeks later, on March 22, 1811, the ship came into sight of its most formidable challenge yet, the Columbia River. Among the tasks that Thorne had been charged with by Astor was the building of a permanent trading post near the critical geographical point where the Columbia River pours into the Pacific Ocean. Even today, the swirling, raging waters of the area provide a daunting task for sailors in modern-day vessels to navigate. But Thorne was unmoved by the fearful sight of the violent, churning waters. His concern was only the task at hand. Thus, on a particularly stormy day, he ordered 5 men to cast out in a rowboat and make their way into the middle of the waters to sound the bottom or determine the depth of the water so that the larger ship could find a spot on the formidable sandbar deep enough for it to get through. The terrified men beseeched Thorn with heartfelt pleas for their lives, as they saw venturing into the turbulent waters before them as tantamount to suicide. J.C. Fox, a veteran Boston sailor and Thorn's first mate, was appointed to lead the task. He was ordered to take a crew composed of 3 French Canadians who had never been to sea before, and an aging Yankee sailor who would be of marginal use at the oars. He protested vociferously to the captain, who only dismissed the terrified young man by turning his back to him and remarking that if he was so afraid of water, he should have stayed in Boston. Thorn ordered them to carry on, insisting that he needed all of his experienced sailors to man the ship in the midst of the repressive squall they were currently enduring. Ultimately, Fox mournfully obliged. He sorrowfully addressed his comrades, saying that his uncle had left his bones at the bottom of this channel only a year before, trying to make the treacherous crossing himself, and that now he would join him. It would be only minutes later when the boat would capsize amidst the waves, killing all 5 men on board. 3 days later, on the 25th of March 1811, another crew of 5 men was ordered to repeat the same mission that had killed their unfortunate comrades scarcely 48 hours earlier. Their small rowboat met the same fate, being capsized in short order amidst the crashing waters. However, this time, one American crew member and one of the Hawaiian Kanakas managed to miraculously make their way to shore after a horrifically harrowing ordeal that saw both nearly succumb to drowning and then hypothermia. The next day, the Tonquin was able to navigate past the sandbar, laying anchor in Baker Bay. Thorn and the remaining members of the crew then came ashore. Over the succeeding few weeks, the crew of the Voyageurs and the remaining Hawaiians would construct a trading post. This post would blossom into an economic hub and is today the town of Astoria, Oregon. As they labored, much of the conversation amongst the men was conducted amongst themselves in their native tongues, so as to be indiscernible to Captain Thorn. But it was clear to the captain, from their tone alone, that the crew were nearing a mutinous fervor. Still, the mission carried on. As the months passed, trade was carried out with curious locals, such as the Clatsop people, a Chinookan tribe that had been encountered by the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1805. Thorn pressed the Clatsop for information on any of their neighbors to the north who might be open to trading as well. He was referred to the Cleoquiot tribe, who resided around the Cleoquiot Bay some 430 miles to the north. The Cleoquiot, meaning the people from Cleoqua or Cleoqui, had recently engaged in peaceable trading with a number of European merchants. They were a hunter-gathering people, descendants of the Nunchanuls. Scant years before, in the late 1700s, they had engaged in prolonged and vicious intertribal warfare in efforts to rid their territories of foreign invaders from rival nations. Thorn was encouraged by the potential profit source and dismissive of any military threat that might be posed against his superiorly armed men aboard their state-of-the-art ship. And so, on June 5, 1811, the Tonquin again crossed the sandbar, leaving the waters of the bay and heading north, again, towards current-day Vancouver, British Columbia. As they traveled north, they stopped intermittently to come ashore and trade with other tribes along the way. During one of these stops, they hired a local native named Hosea Kiao to serve as their interpreter as they continued on northward. Thorn was again cautioned against venturing into the Cleoquiot's territory, as they had recently had some tense dealings with other European traders. Thorn, again, dismissed any threat posed by the natives paddling cedar canoes and wielding homemade war clubs against his mighty and well-armed vessel. During the second week of June, the Tonquin finally made its way into the waters of Cleoquiot Sound. Alexander Mackay, the most experienced Scottish fur trader on board the ship, and Hosea Kiao went ashore to establish relations with the Cleoquiot. They were received peaceably, even being welcomed to stay the night in the chief's longhouse. The next day, as Mackay and Hosea Kiao established trade on shore, a number of Cleoquiot canoes went out to the Tonquin in hopes of bartering for more goods than Mackay and Hosea Kiao had brought with them. Before leaving to come ashore, Mackay had cautioned Captain Thorn of this eventuality, and warned him not to let too many Cleoquiot on board at once. Thorn, wholly inexperienced in trading with natives save for his most recent dealings in the past few weeks, brushed Mackay's concerns aside, again reassuring him that the Tonquin's might rendered it practically invincible to native attack. As curious Cleoquiot clambered on board, Thorn ordered several blankets spread out on deck and trade goods laid upon them. Believing himself a shrewd bargainer, Thorn attempted engaging a Cleoquiot elder, a chief known as Nukami, in trade. He offered 2 blankets, an assortment of beads, and a number of metal fishhooks in exchange for 1 otter pelt, an offer he felt to be more than charitable. Nukami, however, was an experienced and shrewd dealmaker, a veteran of countless dealings with Europeans and other natives throughout his long life. He rejected Thorn's offer outright, scornfully condemning it as egregiously low. Nukami insisted on 5 blankets. Thorn saw this as outright extortion. He angrily turned his back to the chief, stalking off towards his quarters. The chief, indignant himself, followed the captain, taunting him for being such a weak bargainer and waving the otter pelts in the air. Incensed, the captain grabbed one of the furs and, according to varying accounts, either struck the chief with it or rubbed it in his face, shouting, "Damn your eyes!" He subsequently threw Nukami and all of his cohorts off of the Tonquin and sent word from Mackay and Hosiakiao to return. Mackay was horrified at the captain's pomposity, and the experienced traders in the crew now all believed themselves to be in great danger. They insisted that now was the time for the Tonquin to pull up anchors and to take its leave, but Captain Thorn would hear none of it. Just after sunrise on the following morning, a singular canoe appeared on the water, pulling up next to the Tonquin. Captain Thorn, as well as much of the rest of the crew, was still asleep. The Cleoquiot inside the canoe held up furs and made overtures of peace towards the crewmen on watch, who were convinced to let the small ship come aboard. Captain Thorn, as well as Mackay and Hosiakiao, were summoned to the deck, and trading was commenced. But soon, more canoes began to flock to the Tonquin. At first, just a few, but then more, and then more. Again, Mackay and Hosiakiao beseeched Captain Thorn to only allow a small group of Cleoquiot on board at a time. Again, Thorn dismissed their concerns wholeheartedly. Hosiakiao then noticed that many of the Cleoquiot warriors wore fur mantles draped over their necks and shoulders, a curious wardrobe choice considering the warm June weather. Yet again, the captain roundly condemned the idea of being caught off guard by a surprise attack. Finally, the number of Cleoquiot on board the Tonquin became unmanageable, and yet still, the canoes continued to pull up next to the Tonquin. Finally, Thorn was forced to order the decks cleared and the topsails unfurled, and the anchor weighed. The mood on board the ship, and that of Thorn in particular, was rapidly devolving from one of joviality to one of panicked suspicion. As the preparations were being made to move, and the Cleoquiot were being ushered off the Tonquin and back into their canoes, James Lewis, acting as the ship's clerk, had been hunched down next to a bale of blankets, taking stock of inventory. Suddenly, a startling, bone-chilling war cry rang out, piercing the muggy summer air. The Cleoquiot chief standing next to Lewis brandished a large hunting knife, burying it deep into the unfortunate American's back. Lewis fell forward into the ship's companionway, alive but grievously wounded, and a massacre ensued on board the Tonquin. Mackay, standing nearby, was the only crewman who had broken the typical policy which barred anyone from carrying arms above deck without explicit permission, and snuck a pistol into his waistband. With the advent of the attack, Mackay, the seasoned, strong-willed Scotsman, pulled the weapon and made use of its single shot in disposing a lone Cleoquiot warrior. The other warriors immediately leapt upon Mackay, bludgeoning him mercilessly with the war clubs they had concealed beneath their furs. Mackay was then tossed, barely alive, into a canoe where he was dispatched by Cleoquiot women with large oars. Next to fall was Thorn, who in fact fought valiantly and viciously with a pocket knife he kept on his person as he made a desperate bid to get to the cache of weapons kept on board. He managed to eviscerate 4 of his assailants, though he suffered several grievous wounds in the process. He, too, was soon felled by a mighty strike from a war club. The bulk of the pitiable crew on board were then cut and clubbed down over the next few minutes, as the Cleoquiot exacted their revenge for the captain's disrespect. Every sailor on the decks was killed, save for the native translator, Hosiakiao. Also still alive was James Lewis. who had dragged himself into the shadows and hidden for the remainder of the attack. Now satisfied, the Cleoquiot took what goods they fancied most and returned to their canoes, rowing across the placid, chilly waters as the imposing Tonquin now sat still, with its crew cold in death. However, in a miraculous oversight, the Cleoquiot had overlooked the 7 sailors who had climbed into the ship's rigging to unfurl the topmast. After the Cleoquiot made their exit, the sailors made their way to the deck, and then below deck, where they found the dying Lewis. Lewis, resigned to his fate, had told the remaining survivors to cast out in one of the rowboats and that he would stay behind. He burned for revenge against the Cleoquiot and sought to make his last act his retribution. He requested only that he be left with a line of gunpowder stretching from where he lay to the ship's powder magazine, which contained nearly 9,000 pounds of gunpowder. He would wait until they returned the next day, which all assumed to be a certainty, as there was still so much valuable loot left on board. Then, he would blow the ship up. This, he hoped, would create time for his cohorts to escape and eliminate as many of their pursuers as possible. After jarring farewells, the men left Lewis alone with his thoughts as they slipped away in the rowboat. And now, here he sits, retching in pain and smiling to himself as the ship grows heavier and heavier with the weight of the Cleoquiot climbing on board. Before long, roughly 200 warriors swarmed the deck and hulls of the once mighty vessel, now but a carcass to be scavenged. Perhaps Lewis takes one last look at the brilliant British Columbia sky, or thinks once more of his upstate New York home, or the Hawaiian Islands, the Falklands, the bar rooms of New York City, or the beaches of Oahu. Then, as Ozekiel watches from the shore, unaware that there are any survivors at all, the Tonquin erupts, and what is likely the largest explosion that will be seen in the Pacific Northwest until World War II's battle for the Aleutian Islands. A din of grief and horror erupt from the Cleoquiot assembled on shore as a giant fireball consumes what is left of the Tonquin within minutes. Not only is this a tragedy for the Cleoquiot, but the explosion has not served its secondary purpose in providing a distraction for the escaping sailors. According to Ozekiel, they are soon blown to shore by a fierce gale and captured. In retribution for the killing of their tribesmen, the sailors are summarily tortured to death. It will be weeks later when word finally reaches Fort Astoria, passed on by reluctant natives who now seem to be inexplicably fleeing the area. Save for Ozekiel, who is now a prisoner of the Cleoquiot, there are no survivors. The entire crew of the Tonquin, as well as the ship itself, have been lost. Word will make its way to Astor, who will find himself much aggrieved, but more determined than ever to establish a trading foothold in the territory. But the many tales of Astor's ambitions, as well as those of the plight of the peoples of the Pacific Northwest who will suffer untold hardships in the years to follow, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. El Paso, Texas, December 1932. Legendary Texas author and journalist Frank J. Dobie sits in his hotel room, impatiently glancing at the door every few minutes. He has spent a restless afternoon reviewing his notes and readying himself to receive a well-known guest he has long waited to interview. Finally, in the early evening, a knock comes at the hotel room door. Dobie opens the door and is greeted with the imposing frame and genteel smile of the legendary Texas cowboy he has heard so much about, yet never met. The man's name is Frank Collinson. He is an Englishman by birth, having come to Texas from his beloved homeland in 1872, when he was only 17 years old. He has spent the vast majority of his time since then living the hard, solitary, dangerous existence of a working cowboy on the Texas frontier. He is also, though, a lifelong reader, and a man with a profound proclivity for intellectual pursuits, such as philosophy, science, and writing. Dobie and Collinson shake hands and exchange pleasantries as Dobie welcomes the elderly man into his room and out of the December chill. Dobie, already a noted authority on the history of Texas and the American Southwest, has sought Collinson out with the hopes of solving a mystery that he himself has been unable to answer, despite years of research and investigation. After settling into a chair, Collinson, well aware of Dobie's reputation and record, wastes little time broaching the subject of Texas history and regional legends. Collinson asks whether or not Dobie ever got a chance to meet the legendary Texas Ranger William Bigfoot Wallace. Dobie responds that, regrettably, he never had the chance to meet the iconic Ranger face to face. But, he adds, he is well aware of his exploits. With this, Collinson leans into the lamplight, locking eyes with Dobie, a serious expression now drawn across his face. "Did you ever hear of Jeff Turner, the Indian hater?" he inquires. "Yes," replies Dobie, suddenly feeling unnerved, as if he is caught in an impromptu inquisition meant to suss out whether or not he is indeed worthy of the information now stored only within the confines of Collinson's memory. "I have read about him in Duvall's book on Bigfoot Wallace," referring to the 1871 publication written by John C. Duvall entitled The Adventures of Bigfoot Wallace. Apparently satisfied, a knowing smile spreads across Collinson's face, and a sorrowful look takes hold of his eyes as his mind is momentarily lost in the glory and gore of days now long gone. "Does the book tell what became of Jeff Turner?" he asks. "No, and I have often wondered," replies Dobie, now situated unconsciously on the very edge of his hotel seat, already ensconced in the story about to be told. "Well, Bigfoot told me," Collinson opines, and then, as Dobie sits enthralled, begins to tell the tale of what actually happened to the legendary Texas wild man. Turner had come to Texas with his wife and children in the 1830s and settled on a plot of land on the Guadalupe River. For a time, the family had thrived on their small plot of land in the bucolic rolling hill country of central Texas. However, tragedy had struck one morning after Turner had gone out hunting alone. Texas was, at the time, one of the most dangerous locations on Earth. This was due to one predominant factor above all others, that of the mighty Comanche nation. The Comanche had ruled over this land for the better part of 2 centuries and were feared by virtually all. Though more of a cohesive unit of bands than a cultural monolith, by the 1840s, the Comanche oversaw a veritable empire that spanned from southern Kansas to northern Mexico, as far west as Colorado, and as far east as the burgeoning city of Dallas, Texas. They have risen to prominence via decades of brutal raiding and warfare that saw countless men, women, and children fall to Comanche lances, arrows, and tomahawks. Time and again, until their eventual capitulation and confinement to the reservation system in the 1870s, Comanche war parties would strike in brutal raids against any and all who occupied even the fringes of their territories. Whether the victims were Mexican settlers, Tonquin villagers, or Texan farmers, the standard operating procedure for a Comanche raid would routinely see all fighting-age males killed in horrific ways, infants often dispatched, and women and children summarily kidnapped and abused. Oftentimes, whole families would simply be slaughtered, scalped, and left where they had fallen. Such had been the case for the terribly unfortunate Turner family. Jeff Turner had scarcely left his homestead more than half an hour before he heard the blood-curdling sounds of his wife and 3 boys under attack by the Comanche. Turner had sprinted back, only to find his wife and children's lifeless forms strewn about their cabin. When the attacking Comanche returned to finish him off, he had inflicted so much damage that, after believing they had mortally wounded him, the Comanches fled, leaving him for dead. But Turner had not died. He had survived, but his psyche had been irreparably scarred. After recovering for several months under the care of charitable neighbors, Turner would move to a small camp on Chicoloth Creek, north of Victoria, Texas. His life from then on would revolve solely around exacting his revenge on the Comanche for the murder of his beloved family. He would head out alone, atop his trusted horse, a volatile jet-black Mustang named Pepper Pod, following any Comanche trail he could find in the whole of South Texas. He would pursue the Comanche at any opportunity, ambushing them individually on the trail or in watering holes. He would dispatch them with his lengthy hunting knife, scalp them, and cure the gruesome trophies inside his tent on Chicoloth Creek. For the next few years, Turner would appear sporadically at the Zumwalt settlement near present-day Seguin, Texas, in order to procure basic goods and sundries. Though he kept mostly to himself, his eyes would glitter, and his demeanor would become as animated as a vaudevillian actor when describing the intricacies of his macabre favorite pastime. It was these eyes and odd mannerisms that had so unnerved Bigfoot Wallace and his ranger company when they had crossed paths with Turner in 1840. Wallace and his cohorts had been in pursuit of Comanche horse thieves in South Texas when Turner had appeared seemingly out of thin air and offered to guide them through the country he knew so well. Though the party of young rangers were at first dubious as to how much help this seemingly derelict man would be, it would be less than a day later when Turner would prove his merit as both a tracker and a fighter. The party not only recouped their horses in a small but violent skirmish in South Texas, but all were witness to Turner's monomaniacal fury in battle against the Comanche. As they made their way back to the Zumwalt settlement, it was Turner alone whose belt was adorned with several freshly taken Comanche scalps. Wallace had been profoundly impacted by his interactions with Turner, being taken aback both by his story of personal tragedy as well as the frightening intensity of his desire for revenge. But after his company had moved on from the Zumwalt settlement area, Bigfoot was left with only anecdotes and speculation as to the ultimate fate of the local legend, Jeff Turner. These he had passed along to Collinson. Neither had been included in Duval's account, as they were thought too gruesome for the sensibilities of its Victorian readership. In the first of these accounts, Turner is finally caught sleeping by the Comanche in a remote South Texas cold camp in the middle of the night. He is well known among the entirety of the Comanche tribe as a near-feral and wildly vicious white man who had scalped many of their people. He is also, though, regarded as a man with a fierce fighting heart. This, even as an enemy combatant, made him useful to the Comanche. In the theological worldview of the Comanche, there is no singular great spirit to be worshipped. Instead, they believe there to be a universal medicine or power, known as puha, that the Comanche believe to reside in all natural things, from rocks to buffalo. In Turner's case, it is his heart that is believed to hold great power. Thus, once Turner is confined as a Comanche prisoner, he is treated even more harshly than most. Turner is bound and brought to the camp of a major chief within the band. He is dragged to the door of the chief's lodge, inside which resides the chief along with his pregnant wife. The morning sun has not long hung in the Texas sky, but already its repressive heat has begun to exact its toll on the already battered and bedraggled prisoner. The flap which serves as the door of the teepee suddenly swings open, and out steps an imposing middle-aged man, whose face is creased from both the withering of time and his scarcely concealable rage. The chief closely examines the features and stature of this hated Taibo, the Comanche's name for the whites. As the warriors surrounding the chief and Turner taunt and sneer at their captive, the chief motions for them to commence with the ritual at hand. Turner is thrown to the ground, where he is beaten and clubbed further still, as the lashings that bind his hands are undone and 4 warriors grab him. Turner is held down as each of his arms and legs are tethered to wooden stakes buried deep into the hard ground. Turner, for his part, remains silent, though perpetually wide-eyed throughout, as the taunts and insults are hurled at him from assembled villagers, and blows continue to rain down upon him at varying intervals from warriors who had been so long aggrieved by his antics. It is possible that Turner's thoughts turn to his late wife and children. Then, as if on cue, the assembled Comanche villagers and warriors go silent. The chief now walks over to the door of his lodge and again swings it open. Except this time, his wife emerges from the cavernous darkness inside. She is slightly younger than the chief, possessive of a dignified, natural beauty, and in the latter stages of pregnancy. She is ritually adorned in paint and feathers, and, instead of the perpetual disdain that contorts her husband's face, her expression is one of placid indifference. She is brought forth towards Turner's position by 2 female handlers, and sat down perhaps a yard away from the increasingly unnerved Texan, whose breathing rate is beginning to increase by the second. As the sun begins its final ascension towards its noontime apex, the brutal ceremony at hand reaches its climax. The chief brandishes a large hunting knife meant for the butchering of buffalo. For an agonizing few minutes, Turner is taunted with up-close shows of the frightful blade and mock attacks. Finally, Turner is cruelly dismembered at the hands of the Comanche chief, with his heart being removed and then served to his wife, who consumes it in the belief that it will make their unborn child strong and brave. Turner's remains are unceremoniously disposed of, and he is never seen again in the Zumwalt settlement. In the second version of Turner's demise, Turner is said to have been briefly paired with a like-minded frontiersman named Smoky, who shares Turner's penchant and proclivity for collecting Comanche scalps. One day, as they are ranging around the Texas hill country, the duo come upon a family being attacked by a Comanche raiding party. Turner and Smoky are able to draw the attention and ire of the raiding party, who give up their raid on the family and pursue the two men after the pair shot down two of the Comanche warriors from a distance. Turner and Smoky then flee into what proves to be a box canyon, a natural, steeply walled enclosure with no way out save for the way the two men had come in. With the sun sinking and darkness rapidly approaching, the men are able to find a small cave, about as wide in circumference as a wooden barrel, into which they crawl, one after the other. After crawling back into the cave a few yards, the tunnel opens up slightly so that the men can inch along in a crouched position. They advance further into the cave, seeking to put as much distance between themselves and their Comanche pursuers as possible. Turner takes the lead as the men move forward at a tortuously slow pace, in total darkness. Suddenly, the unmistakable sound of a rattlesnake's rattle whirs out within the tight confines of the cave. Both men stop instantly. Turner has a book of Mexican wax matches in his pocket. He retrieves one and strikes it, illuminating a truly nightmarish scene. No more than 10 feet away from the men is a writhing mass of diamondback rattlesnakes, with some branching off and slithering closer towards them while others flee deeper into the cave. With no better solution, both men hold their crouched positions, motionless. Minutes drag by, with the men fearful that any move will draw a strike from one of the venomous creatures. Suddenly, though, Turner's leg spasms, forcing him to shift his weight ever so slightly. But this adjustment, however minute, is still enough to draw the attention of one of the increasingly agitated diamondbacks. The animal strikes Turner, sealing his fate. "Smoky," whispers the terrified Turner, "I've lifted my last scalp." With the Comanche prowling outside, an attempt at escape is an implausible option. All Smoky can do is stay with his friend as Turner expires. Within a short time, Turner begins to twist and contort, limited only by the confines of the earthen walls. He then begins to hallucinate. He grabs Smoky's arm and confides in a hushed, panicked tone. "Look, there's a hole in the ground right in front of me. It's the skylight to hell, and I wonder why the devil left it uncovered." Then, in the words of Frank J. Dobie's own account of the event titled Between the Comanche and the Rattlesnake, "In extravagancies that would have satisfied any exhorter holding a sinner over brimstone furnaces, he described his own advance into the torture of heat and power of hellish beings." By the time the sun rises again, Turner's body is cold in death. The rattlesnake horde has receded further into the cave, while the Comanche war party has moved on. Smoky does his best to respectfully inter Turner's remains in a makeshift grave near Fort Phantom Hill, near present-day Abilene, Texas. Though we can never be fully sure of exactly how the legendary Jeff Turner the Indian hater lost his life, it is safe to say that he likely expired the same way that he had lived, ensnared in a noxious cycle of violence and anger. And while Turner's legend certainly stands out, as he is even known by many elderly residents of Texas to this day, the tragedy and torment that so unfortunately encapsulated his life are not at all unique in the experience of the Old West, and in Texas in particular. The tales of violence, vengeance, and retribution carried out upon and at the behest of the Comanche, the Texans, the Mexicans, the Apache, the Tonkawa, the Karankawa, the Kiowa, and the Spanish in Texas's long and storied history are, to be sure, too numerous to cover in one episode. Rest assured that we will certainly do our best to cover these important events in as much depth and breadth as possible, but for tonight, they are other stories for other times. Southern Mexico, June 24, 1520. Less than 30 years after Christopher Columbus's first voyage to the New World, a group of Spanish conquistadors, led by Hernán Cortés, marches into an urban metropolis that is bigger than anything they had ever seen in Europe. There are markets, neighborhoods, endless crops, massive pyramids with thousands of nearly vertical steps that seem to ascend into the clouds, and a zoo complete with an extensive collection of jungle snakes, birds, and a pair of bison, all of which are the first of their kind these Spaniards had ever seen. On most days, the markets bustle, the crops are worked, and citizens and slaves alike go about their daily tasks as they would in any city throughout the world. But on this day, as Cortés and his contingent plod wearily through the stone-lined streets, the entirety of this metropolis seems cloaked in an eerie silence and stillness. This is not the first time these men have been here. On November 8th of the previous year, the 34-year-old Cortés, an accomplished soldier and conquistador, had led his force of nearly 1,200 Spanish conquistadors, crossbowmen, arquebusiers, cavalry, and indigenous allies into the city, all to great ceremony. The ruling monarch, Montezuma II, had made a great show of showering the Spaniards in magnanimity and presents. Viewed by his people as a sort of hybrid god-king, Montezuma had intended to awe the Spanish with great demonstrations of his power and opulence. His hope had been that Cortés and his cohorts would be cowed by the enormity and scope of this great society, take their gifts of gold and trinkets, and return to their king in order to inform him of the futility of any further attempts at conquest. Unfortunately for himself and his people, Montezuma had wildly underestimated the Spanish thirst for land and riches. He had, to be sure, heard plenty about these ironclad invaders who for months now had been trudging their way inland after sailing to the Yucatan Peninsula from Cuba. The Aztec had ruled the vast majority of southern and central Mexico for centuries by this point, after a rise to power that had come via much warfare, bloodshed, and conquest. They had begun as a wandering tribe of mercenaries who had constructed their mighty city, known as Tenochtitlan, upon the swampy edges of a vast lake. Through decades of dogged construction, expansion, and warfare, they had risen from poverty to prominence. They held their rivals and neighbors in states of perpetual apprehension by a constant warring and raiding upon them. The Aztec viewed themselves as a chosen people whose gods had given them much and thus expected much in return. The Aztec worldview and society was based largely on their religious practices, and those practices were steeped in blood. Though they are ardent polytheists, it is their sacrifices to their patron god, Huitzilopochtli, god of sun and war. Without sufficient blood sacrifice, the Aztecs believed their crops would fail and their families would fall victim to pestilence and disease. Thus, the warfare they made upon neighboring tribes was conducted not with the express intent of killing, but of taking prisoners. These prisoners would become gristle in the mill of industrial sacrifice upon which Aztec society depended. They would be bound and taken back to Tenochtitlan, where they would be kept in cages like livestock. Then, when they were needed for their ultimate ends, each prisoner would be extracted, one by one, and taken to meet their fate. Though ritualistic sacrifice was not a daily occurrence, it is safe to say that it occurred in some capacity on more days than not throughout a calendar year. On these days, atop the largest pyramid structures in the Western Hemisphere, men, women, and children would be ceremonially adorned in paint and costume, then forcibly walked up the steep stairs, and bent face up over a large rock. Their arms and legs would then be held down by 4 priests, themselves adorned in gold, turquoise, and feathers. The high priest would then take an obsidian knife and plunge it into the victim's torso. The priest would extract the victim's vital organs and throw them onto a skillet sizzling nearby, in order to discern the intentions of the gods through the rising smoke and vapors. The Aztec believed that the more the victims were terrified and made to weep and wail, the more efficacious the sacrifice would be. This macabre, merciless scene would take place with such regularity that it necessitated a near constant state of warfare against neighboring tribes in order to provide a sufficient number of sacrificial victims. This need for sacrificial victims drove the rapid expansion of the Aztec Empire and crafted them into a formidable military, economic, and political force in rapid succession. They were unrivaled in their wealth and territory, real estate, and gold. This rise to power had, of course, come at the expense of the surrounding tribes and fostered great resentment towards the Aztecs among their rivals. It was these neighboring tribes, already weakened under the yoke of Aztec rule, that had either thus far been trampled underfoot or submitted to terms as Cortez and his men swept inland from the coast on a quest for glory, gold, and, they believed, God. Among Cortez's ranks of grizzled soldiers and hardened crossbowmen were a number of Catholic priests. The Spanish, their politics being as indivisible from their theology as the Aztecs, considered the presence of Catholic priests to be a prerequisite on any campaign in the name of king and country. Thus, the Spanish viewed their expansion of territory and acquisition of riches as fundamentally inseparable from the expansion of their faith. The conversion of new souls to Christianity, whether by coercion or by force, was seen as a preeminent matter in any successful campaign. These newly conquered converts had, in many cases, beseeched Cortez and the Spanish to continue westward, where they would not only find great fortune in gold and treasures, but great numbers of souls to convert. Cortez saw this as an impassable opportunity to garner great riches for himself and his men, as well as curry great favor with not only the King of Spain, but the Pope. Thus, every gift of gold and jewels that Montezuma bestowed upon Cortez and his men only served to steel their resolve to take this great metropolis over in the name of their king, their country, and their God. And so, rather than taking their leave from the enormous, bustling city of Tenochtitlan with gifts in hand and heads bowed in awe, Cortez and his men placed Montezuma under arrest. For weeks, the ostensibly infallible God King had existed under a tacit house arrest, relaying messages and directives to his people and subordinates, even wandering around the city, but clearly no longer in charge. Even before the arrival of the Spanish, the internal workings of the Aztec hierarchy had been fraught with deceit, scandal, nepotism, and greed. Many of those serving under Montezuma felt that the ruler was not only unfit to serve his people, but actively leading them into disaster. Increasingly, Montezuma's own subjects began to disdain and mistrust him, and a pall of social and political unrest settled over the city of Tenochtitlan. In early May of 1520, intranational conflict called Cortez back to the coast to deal with an attempted usurpation by his rival Panfilo de Narvaez. Cortez left his close friend Pedro de Alvarado in charge of overseeing Montezuma in the city of Tenochtitlan. On May 20th, 1520, after hearing rumors of a plot to attack the Spanish during the festival of Toxcatl, Alvarado ordered what he claimed to be a preemptive attack on the Aztec. Thousands of unarmed civilians were cut down by Spanish swords and arrows, and several members of the Aztec royal court were put to death at the direct order of Alvarado. Following the attack and executions, the Aztec had relentlessly attacked the Spanish, who were forced to barricade themselves inside Montezuma's royal headquarters, the Palace of Huaxcatl. Now, over a month later, Cortez and his men make their way through the stark silence of the city streets unmolested. They arrive to find the palace in disrepair after incessant attacks, and their comrades mentally and physically exhausted. They are greeted as saviors by their comrades, who have all but resigned themselves to death, trapped here in the middle of the city with limited ammunition and vastly outnumbered. But the joviality and relief of the moment are quickly overshadowed by Cortez's rage towards his temporary replacement, Alvarado. He berates Alvarado for his cowardice and short-sightedness. Alvarado insists that had he not attacked the Aztecs first, the entire Spanish contingent, left behind by Cortez, would have been wiped out. But Cortez has received word while on his return trip from Montezuma himself via a letter snuck out of the city that the Aztecs had in fact gained permission from Alvarado before making their typical preparations for their festival. Had he solely intended to thwart their attack, suspending the festival preparations would have been a far more obvious and less costly option. Instead, Alvarado had attacked, and in the process damaged the trust of not only the Aztecs, but of the other surrounding tribes who were now rightfully dubious as to the sincerity of the Spaniards. Now, Cortez knows a hornet's nest has been irreversibly stirred, and he and his men will have to deal with the immediate consequences. He is furious with Alvarado, proclaiming that, "I wish to God Montezuma had escaped, and I had never had to listen to this story." Cortez exercises no corporal punishment on Alvarado, only demoting him from second-in-command and replacing him with the more level-headed Gonzalo de Sandoval. Though the size of his force had dissuaded an initial attack from the Aztec, they are now essentially trapped inside the city. Their food is running low, and with the Aztec markets closed and the people hostile and unwilling to barter or trade, the prospect of running out of food and potable water is becoming more and more plausible by the minute. As the totality of his predicament becomes more and more apparent, Cortez's anger boils over towards Montezuma as well. He suspects the Aztec ruler of colluding with his rival Narvaez in secret correspondence, promising him great riches and power should he assist in ridding Tenochtitlan of his troublesome countrymen. Montezuma, who has spent the majority of his time shackled and despondent inside the palace walls as the citizens who once revered him now intermittently attack his palace and hurl insults at his overseers, is elated to see Cortez return. Through interpreters, he asks to meet with Cortez. This further enrages the already riled conquistador. "Meet with me? Why, the dog will not even keep the markets open," Cortez exclaims. Montezuma explains pitifully that he no longer wields the power he once did. The god emperor that had ruled over Tenochtitlan and the whole of the Aztec world has, since Cortez's arrival, fallen to the internal disputes and external machinations of his people. But Cortez, however aware he might be of the validity of Montezuma's claims, refuses to listen. He insists that if Montezuma does not hold the necessary sway over his people, he should choose an underling whom he believes does, and that man will be sent out from the palace to convince his fellow Aztecs to reopen the marketplaces. Montezuma chooses his brother, Cuitlahuac, who is also being held prisoner in the palace. Cortez, in a decision he will later regret bitterly, agrees and sends Cuitlahuac out to placate the festering conflict. However, instead, Cuitlahuac sends word forth that the time to attack the Spanish is now, when they are weakened, tired, hungry, and trapped. He meets with the remaining political elite who had not been arrested or killed in Alvarado's attack, and an emergency council is held, officially nullifying Montezuma's power as ruler. Instead, Cuitlahuac is installed as the new ruler. The morning after releasing Cuitlahuac, Cortez sends out a lone messenger, headed for the coast, with an emergency dispatch calling for reinforcements. It is assumed that, with the streets empty, he will pass out of the city with ease and be on his way to call for assistance. However, in less than 30 minutes, the messenger rushes back through the gates of the palace, bearing fresh wounds from Aztec slings and arrows, and insisting that the city is crawling with amassing forces, readying to attack the palace. Cortez's guards, stationed at portholes around the palace's walls, soon confirm the messenger's chilling report. To their horror, a veritable cloud of Aztec warriors is now sweeping their way through the streets in full war regalia, with shields, obsidian clubs, and feathers gleaming brightly in the harsh Mexican summer sun. The more seasoned conquistadors among the men begin to deliberately prepare for what, many assume, will be their last fight. Many of the less experienced men, who had been left behind under the command of Alvarado and endured the weeks of intermittent attacks and nightly torment and taunts from the Aztecs, are now at their veritable breaking point. Hernan Cortez seems completely preoccupied in his own rage towards his subordinate commanders and towards Montezuma. He believes the ineptitude of Alvarado, coupled with the corruption of Montezuma and his cohorts, are to blame for his current predicament, and he is irate. Montezuma, the man who had once been treated as a divine being anywhere he strode throughout his kingdom, now sits dejectedly in a dingy corner of a back room. His wrists and ankles, once covered in the finest jewelry, now ache and chafe under the confines of his iron shackles. As his former subjects now amass in front of his once opulent palisade, Montezuma hangs his head in equal parts despair and resignation. He tells his captors that he no longer desires to live, and that they too will perish here, under the war clubs and arrows of his Aztec countrymen. He has accepted his fate, he says, and so must they. Cortez's rage, already white-hot, is only stoked further upon hearing Montezuma's pitiable calls to surrender to their fate. He barges into the room in which Montezuma is being held and storms up to the Aztec ruler, their faces only inches apart. Through gritted teeth, Cortez demands Montezuma walk out onto the exposed palace wall and order his people to stand down. They must, Cortez still believes, listen to their deified ruler. But Montezuma insists again that he no longer holds any consequential power amongst his people. He is, in fact, now a figure of great derision amongst the population of Tenochtitlan. Should the warriors now swarming outside catch sight of him, they will surely kill him, Montezuma insists. But Cortez will hear none of it. He orders 2 Spaniards to take Montezuma, forcibly, to the top of the wall facing the throngs of Aztec warriors, readying to make their attack on the palace. The 2 conquistadors pull Montezuma to his feet and march him out to the top of the wall. As they advance to the exposed position, arrows, stones, and spears fill the air, and they are only spared death by covering themselves with their heavy shields. Still arguing that this tactic was all but suicidal, Montezuma is dragged the final few steps to the top of the wall and ordered once again to address his people. Accounts vary on what happens next, with one version attesting to the fallen king's attempts at overtures of peace to his people. The other states that the disgraced ruler was not even given a chance to speak. In either case, Montezuma is, in short order, met with a hail of arrows and stones, at least 3 of which strike him in the head and chest. The Spaniards hurriedly reclose their ad hoc shield wall around his body and drag him back to the relative cover of a palace room. As Montezuma now lies mortally wounded, slipping in and out of consciousness, Cortez determines, in traditional conquistador fashion, to take the offensive, and orders Diego de Ordaz and a few hundred men to charge out of the gates and take the fight to the Aztecs. Cortez hopes the firepower of the Spanish muskets and crossbows will drive off the attack of the Aztec. But this idea, too, falls under a hail of stones and arrows, and de Ordaz and his surviving men soon rush back into the palace, defeated and crestfallen. De Ordaz has been badly wounded in 3 places, and while he was out, Cortez too has taken a grievous wound to his left hand from an Aztec war club. Roughly 80 other Spaniards also lay injured in various spots throughout the palace compound. Cortez, left hand dangling uselessly at his side, orders a relentless series of volleys from the muskets, cannons, crossbowmen, and archers into the Aztec hordes at the palace gate. Again and again, shots are poured into the attacking Aztec, seemingly to no effect. Soon, flame-tipped arrows begin to fall into the palace, igniting any wooden structures within and engulfing the compound in smoke and flames. Cortez and his men hurriedly work to put out the flames, heaping dirt and mud upon them as they simultaneously shoot into the attacking crowd of Aztecs and hack at those attempting to crest the walls. For the better part of a week, the battle rages on. At night, cloaked in darkness, Aztec priests hurl curses from their gods upon the Spanish, berating the conquistadors and their indigenous allies as cowards, and taunting that they would soon sacrifice them and feast upon their bodies. On the 29th of June, Montezuma finally succumbs to his wounds. The great chief who had descended from such a storied lineage, who had overseen an empire to rival the greatest rulers of the world, and who had believed himself divine, now lies cold in death. The Aztec world has been irreparably changed, and the beginning of their end has now officially arrived. Whether the citizens of Tenochtitlan and the warriors raining down hellfire upon the Spanish inside the palace compound know it or not, their way of life is now, effectively, over. Within a year's time, their city will fall to the mighty Spanish Empire. Their gods will be outlawed, their temples destroyed, and vast swaths of their population will fall to mysterious diseases brought over by these alien invaders. However, even as the fallen king lies in permanent repose, Hernán Cortés and the men under his command are still trapped inside the ruins of this once opulent testament to their enemy's grandeur. The story of their escape, as well as the subsequent takeover and pillaging of the once mighty metropolis, is one of the most brutal, jarring accounts of history in what Europeans would come to know as the New World. But the tale of Cortez's ultimate escape and revenge, as well as that of the Aztecs' macabre fall into destitution and despair, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Monterey, California, March 6, 1846. As a cool wind whips over their position atop a high mountain peak, John C. Fremont looks down upon the amassing forces of Mexican army troops with equal parts disdain and trepidation. Above him, attached to a long fallen tree branch turned into a makeshift flagpole, the American flag flutters in the breeze. Every man atop this Northern California mountain peak knows that their presence here is already tantamount to trespassing, and that Fremont's insistence on climbing to their current position and then raising the American flag is an explicit and obvious declaration of war against the ruling Mexican government. Fremont, already a national celebrity for his accomplishments as an explorer and military man, has climbed to his current location with his force of 60 American soldiers, sailors, and frontiersmen in hopes of making a stand against the vastly superior forces of the Mexican army deep in the heart of California territory. As word spreads to Mexican officials in the surrounding territories, the open fields in the valleys below the mountain begin to fill with more and more Mexican troops and local volunteers. Meanwhile, atop the peak, Fremont has ordered the construction of a makeshift timber fort in order to create some measure of bulwark defense against the overwhelming attack to come. As his men hack down trees and dig post holes into the dense, dark mountain soil, Fremont is confronted with the increasingly stark reality of his and his men's situation. The mood amongst the Americans is tense, and speech amongst the men is terse and unsure. Many see their present circumstances as all too reminiscent of the infamous 1836 Battle of the Alamo, in which 180 brave Texans had perished in a valiant but incredibly brutal last stand, which had cost every one of them their lives. Now, many among the Americans atop the high Northern California peak fear that they, too, will meet a similar fate. They are, in point of fact, trespassers in a foreign land, here under the false and transparently flimsy pretext that they are merely wayward American explorers, who simply happened upon this territory while on a quest to survey the whole of the United States' rightful territory. In reality, however, Fremont and his men are on what amounts to a scouting mission for the United States government, who, in 1846, has increasingly explicit interests in seizing the territory comprising northern Mexico known as Alta California. Already known nationwide as the Pathfinder, Fremont views himself as perhaps the preeminent agent of the American concept of manifest destiny, the notion that a continent-spanning nation is the ultimate end, an undeniable right, of the still relatively new country. John Charles Fremont had been born in Savannah, Georgia in 1813. His father was a French-Canadian schoolteacher, and his mother the youngest daughter of a prominent Virginia plantation owner. After his father's tragic passing in 1818, the family had moved to Charleston, South Carolina, where the precocious young Fremont obtained his early education from a local lawyer by the name of John W. Mitchell. Fremont had briefly attended Charleston College, studying mathematics and natural sciences, before being expelled in 1831 for lack of attendance. While teaching mathematics in the local countryside, however, Fremont had earned the praises of prominent local politician Joel R. Poinsett, a rabid Jacksonian Democrat who was able to leverage his influence to secure Fremont a position teaching mathematics aboard the USS Natchez, a U.S. naval sloop which sailed the seas around South America in 1833. Fremont's tenure on the seas would be short-lived, however, as he soon left this position to accept an appointment as second lieutenant with the U.S. Topographical Corps. Here, he worked surveying a route for the Charleston, Louisville, and Cincinnati Railroad. It was during this time that Fremont's true interest in exploration and map-making was piqued. A stint working in the Carolina mountains only served to solidify his desire to become an explorer, and between 1837 and 1838, he served on a reconnaissance detail in Georgia in preparation for the United States government's removal of the Cherokee tribe from the area. In March of 1837, Fremont's former mentor Joel R. Poinsett was appointed as Secretary of War under President Martin Van Buren. With his new powers of office, Poinsett arranged for Fremont to accompany French scientist and explorer Joseph Nicolet in his exploration of the territory between the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. Serving under Nicolet, Fremont built a reputation as a revered topographer, adept in astronomy, geology, the description of local flora and fauna, as well as being possessive of an inquisitive and ambitious nature. In 1841, he married Jessie Benton, the daughter of Thomas Hart Benton, a Missouri politician and chairman of the Senate Committee on Military Affairs. Thomas Benton had initially refused the 28-year-old Fremont's request for his daughter's hand in marriage, arguing that the young man was not part of American high society and thus not a fitting match for his 16-year-old daughter. However, the couple eventually eloped, and while initially irate at the news, the bride's father eventually warmed to the marriage and to his new son-in-law. A die-hard expansionist and devotee of manifest destiny, Thomas Benton soon advocated for the necessity of sending survey teams west to scout potential transcontinental routes that could facilitate the large numbers of people they believed would soon be flooding into the untouched reaches of the continent. Benton also insisted that his son-in-law, John C. Fremont, was the only acceptable man to place in charge of these exploratory expeditions, with his combination of academic training, real-world experience, and political connections. Beginning in 1842, Fremont had led 3 expeditions. The first began in the summer of 1842 with an exploration of the budding Oregon Trail, following the South Pass that legendary mountain man Jedediah Smith had pioneered through the Rocky Mountains a generation earlier. They returned to Washington in October, and both John and Jessie Fremont soon rose to national renown with their published account of Fremont's expedition entitled A Report of the Exploring Expedition to the Rocky Mountains, which became a nationwide success virtually overnight, stirring the restless imaginations of countless readers with its accounts of the Rocky Mountains, the Great Plains, and the various peoples, plants, and animals that inhabited the area. The unfettered success of Fremont's first expedition soon saw him appointed to his second, this one charging him with leading another expedition to South Pass, but this time pushing beyond it in a search of a route to the Pacific. This second expedition was equally as successful as the first, if not more so, as Fremont completed the transcontinental journey from Washington to present-day Sacramento, and then back to St. Louis in August of 1844. From here, his account of his second expedition was sent to publication, and in Washington, both the Senate and the House ordered 10,000 copies each. With the success of Fremont's first 2 expeditions, the 1845 election of James K. Polk as president, and continually rising tensions between the United States and Mexico in regards to the territory west of the Mississippi River and north of the Rio Grande, a third expedition was commissioned in 1845. However, this trip, while still being conducted under the auspices of a mere exploration, was planned with far more militaristic ends in mind. Fremont was again placed in charge, and this time specifically commissioned by the War Department to survey the central ranges of the Rocky Mountains, the Great Salt Lake Basin, and the central ranges of the Sierra Nevada Range, with the end goal of ascertaining the strength of the Mexican military in these areas, mapping and recording potential routes of ingress and egress for American military forces, and to determine the loyalty of the local citizenries to the Mexican government. This third expedition had struck out from St. Louis on June 1st of 1845. They traveled west, passing through Bent's Fort and by the Great Salt Lake. When the party reached the Ogden River, today known as the Humboldt River, Fremont divided the men into 2 groups in hopes of doubling his effectiveness in surveillance by covering more ground in more directions. With 16 men, Fremont had arrived at Sutter's Fort, near present-day Sacramento, on December 9th, 1845. Here, he did his utmost to incite an air of patriotic fervor amongst the American expatriates who now called the area home. In the preceding decades, many of the peoples who called Northern California home had built a growing resentment towards the Mexican government, who tended to treat the citizens of Alta California as dismissible inhabitants of an expansive, wild, and altogether unknowable territory that merited little, if any, attention from officials whose constituents and concerns were situated almost entirely around the capital of Mexico City and its surrounding areas. Little in the way of formal official backing, Fremont had promised the aggrieved inhabitants of Sutter's Fort and the surrounding areas that, should they muster a rebellion against their oppressors in the Mexican government, he would ensure they had the full backing and support of the United States government. From Sutter's Fort, Fremont and his small party made their way west to the coastal town of Monterey, where Fremont met with American Consulate Thomas O. Larkin and the official Mexican Comandante, Jose Castro. Here, Fremont managed to simultaneously request replenishments of his supplies, while all the while surreptitiously continuing to survey the area for offensive strengths, defensive vulnerabilities, and local morale. By February of 1846, the party of 45 men who had separated from the original group to survey further north had reunited with Fremont and his group of 16 men at Mission San Jose, just north of Monterey. But the increased size of Fremont's contingent of Americans, as well as the duration of their stay, soon drew the suspicion of Comandante Jose Castro, who eventually ordered that Fremont and his men exit the whole of the Alta California territory. But, rather than acquiesce to the lawful order, Fremont had decided that he and his men would make their stand here, and lay claim to American soil that Fremont believed to be rightfully and providentially theirs. And so now, as word spreads through the nearby ranchos and small towns that a group of Americans had laid claim to Mexican territory in a direct provocation of their local government, Fremont and his men hunker down for the vicious battle to come. Ammunition is plentiful but finite, and with a total force of only 61 men, it is obvious to all that, even with their position atop this high ground, the Americans are not prepared to withstand a prolonged assault. Their nearest infantry reinforcements are hundreds of miles away, and their naval reinforcements practically non-existent here on the Alta California coast. The growing unease amongst the men with their current circumstances leads one amongst them to finally speak up. But this man is no rank-and-file member of the American force. He is, in point of fact, the real driving force behind Fremont's expeditionary successes thus far. His name is Christopher Houston Carson, better known as Kit Carson. Having already spent a decade of his life surviving the continent's harshest environs, few names on the American frontier garner as much reverence and recognition as his. While Fremont has indeed earned his reputation as a tireless explorer, it is Carson who has provided the experience, insight, and essential skills to facilitate that ambition and wanderlust. While politicians in Washington, D.C. could only pontificate on what the vast expanses of the largely unknown frontier might possess, Carson was already long familiar with the territories, landmarks, weather, wildlife, and native tribes that only a handful of Americans had ever even heard of. While barely literate and possessing none of the requisite pedigree of Washington officials, Carson is a master trapper, tracker, tanner of hides, horseman, sharpshooter, navigator, linguist, negotiator, and could build or break down a campsite in mere minutes. He was fleet of foot on the trail, cool under pressure in a fight, and unwavering in his allegiance to his own personal code of honor and ethics. Only a few years prior, at the annual Mountain Man Rendezvous in present-day Wyoming, Carson had challenged a drunken and belligerent Frenchman to a pistol duel on horseback, after he found out the man had publicly affronted one too many trappers and accosted a number of the attending women. The duel had ended with Carson coolly riding towards his opponent before loosing a ball from his pistol that shattered the man's wrist, resulting in his forfeiting the duel. Word of Carson's reputation as not only a skilled trapper, but a man not to be trifled with, had spread far and wide, and by the time he crossed paths with one John C. Fremont, Fremont was well aware of his reputation. The two had met while traveling on a steamboat up the Missouri River, and Fremont had convinced Carson to accompany his expedition and lend them his valuable skills. Time and again in the preceding years, Carson's know-how and wherewithal had been the prevailing cause behind the entire expedition's survival against dire odds. Not at all unaware of Carson's necessity and his successes, Fremont began to include effusive praise for his vaunted guide in the correspondence he sent back to Washington. Once, when report came to their group that a war party of Pawnee warriors were scouring the area, Carson had leapt on his horse, without even pausing to saddle the animal, and, with only rifle in hand and a knife in his belt, ridden off over the rolling prairie hills in order to scout the area for threats. Fremont recounted, quote, "Mounted on a fine horse without a saddle and scouring bareheaded over the prairies, Kit was one of the finest pictures of a horseman I have ever seen." End quote. Soon, these sentiments became part of the national conversation, as Carson's reputation as a sort of frontier superhero spread from the expanses of the prairies to the pages of dime novels and newspapers, eagerly devoured by readers in cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. But Kit Carson, for all his vaunted courage and newfound national acclaim, is no fool. Though he is a flawed man as any, he is not vain, nor concerned with his legacy or his own country's expansion to the extent that he is willing to risk the almost certain deaths of himself and his comrades purely in the name of jingoistic fervor. Carson and the rest of the men atop the mountain believe their task to be increasingly futile with every passing hour, as numbers of Mexican soldiers in the fields below them increase from dozens to hundreds, their leadership and rank and file alike rightfully indignant at the Americans' arrogant and ill-advised occupation of their land. Thomas O. Larkin, the American consulate, himself supports Jose Castro's order for Fremont to vacate the Alta California territory. With years of tensions between Mexico and America already festering, Larkin had become increasingly worried that Fremont's actions would spark the tinderbox of already tenuous relations between the two countries. Now, it seems that bloodshed is inevitable. For their part, the California citizens as well take great offense at the incursion of this force of what are effectively foreign spies in their homeland. Though long neglected by the Mexican government, as they had been under its predecessor in the Spanish government, the Californios are a fiercely independent people, comprised largely of ranchers, farmers, and vaqueros, who carve out livings from the land's abundance while tending to the hostile local tribes, corrupt government officials, and, of course, the hulking California grizzly bears that populate the state in great numbers. They are master horsemen, adept in not only extraordinary feats of riding, but in wielding their long leather riatas in combination with elongated, steel-tipped lances. Though the tactic may appear comically antiquated at first to an enemy force wielding pistols and rifles, the California forces have perfected the technique of roping enemy combatants from their horses, at which point their lance-wielding comrades ride in to dispatch the unfortunate man. For their part, the massing Mexican military forces under the command of Comandante Castro are underfunded, under-equipped, and perpetually undermanned. Here on the fringes of Mexico's northernmost territories, they receive little in the way of formal direction or support. However, with the American flag now flying above their mountain peak, their directive is clear: force the Americans to leave at any cost. As rosters are composed and equipment is cleaned and checked amongst the Mexican forces, the consensus amongst Fremont's men, argued foremost by Kit Carson himself, is that there will be no honor to be had in the rout that is to come. They are under no illusions that the sacrifice of their lives will go on to uphold or inspire a revolution against the presiding Mexican government, as it had in Texas with the Battle of the Alamo. Instead, they assume that they will simply be wiped out, left as nothing more than a curious footnote in history as a band of impetuous madmen who had attempted to overthrow a sitting government. However, despite the seemingly utter futility of their situation, Fremont remains unmoved. For 3 long days, despite the consternation from within his ranks, Fremont refuses to surrender his position. Finally, on the 3rd day, it is clear that the Mexican forces in the valley below have been fully assembled. Within the next day, an attack will be imminent. Many among the American men spend their evening picking at their scant rations for supper and deep in concern and anxiety for the terrors that the sunrise will bring. Now, even Fremont's resolve begins to wane. What had seemed such an ignoble and selflessly patriotic act only days earlier now seems to be a prison of circumstance, trapping Fremont between his competing interests for glory and self-preservation. As the last vestiges of the sun's rays sink below the dark horizon of the Pacific, many among the Americans believe it to be the last sunset that they will ever see. As darkness sets in, it brings with it the nighttime chill so common to the area. For hour after fitful hour, Fremont, Carson, and the other Americans shiver restlessly under thin blankets as the wind begins to pick up throughout the night. Finally, the sunrise breaks, clear and still, and the men wake to a chilling omen. At some point during the night, the makeshift flagpole that had been erected 4 days earlier has been blown down by the swirling Bay Area winds. Now, the American flag that had flown so boldly lies sullied in the dark soil of Gavilan Peak. The consensus among the men, as the sun continues to rise, is that this final indignity to their nation's colors most assuredly does not bode well for their efforts in the battle to come. Even Fremont, who had watched the sunset without wavering in his resolve to hold the mountaintop, looks upon the soiling of their flag as a particularly bad omen. Suddenly, as the totality of his situation sets in, and the hour of attack nears for the Mexican troops massing down below them, Fremont begins to reconsider his options. He knows that he can either stand and fight, likely at the cost of his own life and the lives of his men, or surrender their position and retreat from the mountain peak. After a few tense minutes of consideration, Fremont finally gives the order for the Americans to strike camp and proceed down the westerly slope of Gavilan Peak. This the men readily do, with most nearly elated at having avoided the fate that had been met in San Antonio a decade earlier by men like Colonel Travis, Jim Bowie, and Davy Crockett. As the sun continues to rise and the area's notorious morning overcast begins to clear, the Mexican forces, too, are relieved to look upon the mountaintop and find it devoid of American forces. Gavilan Peak, where the American forces had made their ill-advised stand, is today known as Fremont Peak, located between the cities of Monterey and Santa Cruz, California. Fremont will go on to move his men north, heading through the northern reaches of the San Joaquin Valley before pushing on to Klamath Lake in Oregon. On the way, the expedition encountered several native tribes, and hostilities ensued, with several natives left dead and more bad will being accumulated by Fremont in the California Territory. However, Fremont, Carson, and the men of this expedition will find no respite in Oregon. Soon, they will be called back to California after being located in the middle of the wilderness by a United States Marine captain on a top-secret mission with correspondence from Washington, D.C. But before Fremont and his men can make their way south again, they will find themselves victims to a surprise attack by the Klamath tribe, who are incensed at the Americans' presence in their lands. This will cost the lives of several expedition members and result in a retributory raid with sickening consequences for the local native tribes. Though the fight for the mountaintop has been narrowly avoided, the coming Mexican-American War will only intensify in California in the coming years. But the countless tales of John C. Fremont, Kit Carson, and the other Americans who will make their way westward in the fight for American expansion in the coming years, as well as the stories of the Mexican citizens and the native tribes who sought to retain their own homelands, are, for tonight, other stories for other times.
Thank you again for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the join button below. And we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.